We had been driving through the forest for about 20 minutes when my daughter started acting strange. Kylie was ordinarily a loud, active toddler with so much energy that my wife and I usually had to drag ourselves along behind her. Yet now, in the shadow of the huge evergreens, she had fallen silent. "Everything okay back there?" I asked. No response. "You excited about visiting the park, honey? We might even see a bear." I tried again. Still nothing. Kylie was staring with absolute concentration at the shadows beneath the trees. "Kylie, honey," my wife Heather reached back and shook Kylie's knee. "There's a man in the woods," Kylie said simply. "Of course there is, honey. It's a national park," I laughed, but Kylie just scowled and looked back out the window. I sighed. The sun was just starting to cast its golden beams through the misty woods, and if Kylie was in one of her moods, we had a very long day ahead of us. I spotted a gravel turnoff up ahead, and it occurred to me that maybe Kylie was just grumpy from the long car ride. My wife and I were plenty sore ourselves, and the prospect of dipping our feet in a cool mountain stream was too good to miss. I pulled in beside a dusty pickup truck and flashed a mischievous grin at Heather. We were both out the door as soon as the wheels stopped turning. Kylie, however, refused to budge. "This is a bad place. I don't want to." My daughter crossed her arms. There was no reasoning with her when she was like this. I nodded to my wife, and we each grabbed an arm to lift her out of the car seat. Kylie wailed and clawed, putting up such a fight that I was grateful I'd trimmed her nails in the hotel room the night before. I looked over my shoulder at the pickup and winced. If the driver was around, he'd probably think Kylie was being kidnapped. "There's a creek down there with big rocks and fish and waterfalls," I coaxed. "You're going to love it, Kai." Suddenly my daughter stopped crying, but it didn't have anything to do with my pep talk. "Okay, Daddy, let's go." Her arms had gone slack, her face blank. I'd only ever seen her like this once before, when our plane had hit a gut-dropping patch of turbulence, the kind that makes passengers wail, luggage fall, and lights flicker. Then as now, she just shut down, too frightened to function. I couldn't imagine what was scaring her so badly. Apart from the rustling leaves and the murmur of the stream below, the early morning forest was still. I slipped a neon pink jacket over Kylie's head before lifting her onto my shoulders and starting down the steep, muddy trail. Heather let out a loud whoop and sprinted past me. I winced. It felt wrong to disturb the silence, I thought, then wondered if Kylie's irrational fear had infected me as well. We found Heather lying on a smooth white stone beside the water, kicking her feet in the rapids. "It's so peaceful here," she smiled, and I had to agree. Even Kylie seemed to be doing better. She sat at the edge of a rock, absent-mindedly tugging at clumps of moss. "You're pretty quiet, champ." Heather rustled our daughter's hair. "I'm listening to the man in the woods." Kylie replied with that same flat voice. A shiver ran up my spine. Most toddlers say creepy things from time to time, but Kylie had never gone this deep into her dreams before. "What man in the woods, honey?" "Nobody's talking." "Yes, he is. I can hear him. He's talking inside my head." Heather and I exchanged a glance. "What's the man saying, champ?" Heather asked. Kylie just frowned and pulled away, as if to say that whatever it was none of our business. The morning air seemed suddenly just a little bit cooler. A bird took off from a branch above us, and Heather and I both jumped, but not our Kylie. Our daughter was staring dead ahead at something on the other side of the creek. Before either of us could stop her, she got on all fours and scurried across the smooth river rocks. It's amazing how fast small children can move when they really want to. By the time we got to our feet, Kylie was halfway across the creek. Not being a barefoot toddler myself, I slipped almost instantly, plunging into the freezing waist-deep water. My daughter, meanwhile, had already reached the far bank. I felt a sudden, horrible certainty that if she climbed up it, we would never see her again. Fortunately, my wife was a lot less clumsy than I was. Jumping from rock to rock, she managed to grab the back of Kylie's pink jacket before she disappeared into the ferns. Ordinarily, Kylie screamed her head off whenever we stopped her from doing what she wanted to do. But now she was calm. In fact, she was giggling. "Daddy got wet." Kylie, it is not okay to run off like that. What's gotten into you? My wife demanded. He said it would be funny, our daughter replied, with an all-too-adult sneer in her eyes. And he was right. Only then did it occur to me to climb the eroded bank and see what had made Kylie so eager to cross the stream. My fingers sank into the mud as I pulled myself upward. Then I fell back with a yelp as sharp teeth sank into my ankle. Kylie! Heather yelled. My daughter had bitten me. He doesn't like it when you look, Kylie hissed. That's enough, I grunted and picked my daughter up. She went into full tantrum mode, battering me with her tiny fists, but I was finally able to peer over the muddy creek bank. I saw only more trees, rotting logs, and a carpet of decaying leaves. Whatever Kylie had been so eager to get to, it was long gone. It was the worst fit Kylie had thrown in years, maybe ever. Getting a flailing, screaming, biting child back across the slippery rocks was no easy feat. By the end of it, all three of us were soaked and exhausted. I reached out for the car door and patted my hip for my keys. They weren't there. Had their clip come undone when I'd fallen in the water? Or had Kylie pulled them off on purpose? I didn't like to think about what that might mean. The keys, I groaned. I have to go back. Heather looked up at me from where she was struggling with Kylie. Her eyes begged me not to go. I understood how she felt. The day had suddenly turned strange and wrong, and all I wanted to do now was get back in the car with my family, drive out of the forest, and forget that any of it had ever happened. I glanced over at the pickup truck beside us. It was covered with dust and dead leaves, as though it had been sitting there abandoned for years. And what had happened to the driver? Something seemed to slither beneath the grimy blue tarp in the truck bed. I shuddered and turned back to my family. Kylie had finally calmed down. She sat in the gravel, messy hair hanging over her face, not saying a word. "Babe, please," my wife whispered. "Why don't we just go back to the road? We can flag someone down, ask them to call for help." Images flashed through my head. Long, hungry hours waiting for some smug tow truck driver. Yet another bill for my already bloated credit card. Kylie crying nonstop. Our vacation ruined. No, I couldn't let that happen. All I had to do was walk back down the trail and grab my keys. So why did that suddenly feel so hard to do? I took a last look around. The winding two-lane road should have been packed, but not a single car had passed by. I could feel my wife's eyes on the back of my neck, pleading with me. "Stay," they seemed to say. I'm scared. As much as I wanted to, someone had to get us out of the woods. Shivering in my waterlogged jeans, I stuffed my hands into my pockets and trudged back down the trail. I found myself wishing that somebody else would appear, just to confirm that we were still inside the borders of the national park at all. A grimy backpacker, an old fisherman on his way to the creek, anybody other than Kylie's man in the woods. Although I kept my eyes down in search of the keys, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd look up and find him just in front of me, looking like the Green Knight from some childhood storybook. A mossy beard, a crown of antlers, golden animal eyes. A footstep crunched in the leaves to my left. Glancing up, I saw an enormous stag making its way through the trees. There was something unsettling about the way it moved. It didn't look my way, didn't freeze when it saw me. It just kept walking straight ahead, like it was being guided by some terrible purpose. It was heading for the car. I jogged back up the slick path. The stag had reached the edge of the forest. Heather, oblivious, was squatting in the gravel, trying to talk to Kylie. My daughter sat with eerie patience, staring straight ahead, like she knew the stag was coming. From my vantage point, I could see how it walked out of the tree line and knelt down in front of her, as though inviting her to ride it. I could hear my wife and daughter arguing. "Honey, get back! That's a wild animal. You don't know what it might do." "The man in the woods said I should go with it, Mommy. He says where I'm going, there's lots of other kids just like me." Heather had heard enough. She grabbed for Kylie's arm, but the stag came between them, snorting and frothing at the mouth. It reared backward and rammed its head into my wife's chest. Heather flew backwards, impacted against the driver's side mirror with a sickening crack. She crumpled to the ground and lay still. Kylie, meanwhile, was already climbing onto the stag's back. "No!" I screamed. "Kylie, wait!" But the big animal was already moving. My daughter clung to the mangy fur of its neck. Her golden hair flashed in a beam of sunlight. Then she and the stag were gone, swallowed by the shadows of the forest. I ran to my wife. Heather was hurt, but breathing. I was trying desperately to remember my Cub Scout first aid when I heard tires crunching on the gravel. It was an ancient Park Service vehicle, and the woman behind the wheel looked just as grizzled as the car itself. She couldn't have been older than 30, but her sharp green eyes missed nothing. "Everything all right here, sir?" the ranger asked. Her hand was on the pistol at her hip as she stepped out of the vehicle. "My wife, she was attacked by a deer," I stammered. "And my daughter, she's missing." "Let me see your hands." I did as I was told and realized she was looking for blood or bruising on my knuckles, signs that I had been the one to slam my wife against the side of the car. "Okay," she grunted. "Step back." She bent down to inspect Heather. My wife let out a gasp as the ranger pressed on her right side. "Ribs broken," the ranger grunted. "She should probably get to a doctor. Now what's this I hear about a missing daughter?" I launched into my story, leaving out the harder-to-believe elements. That made sense at the time. I told the ranger that Kylie had simply run off into the woods after a deer. Only later would I realize what a terrible mistake I had made. "Time's a-wasting, then," the ranger said. "Most lost kids are found within a couple hours. The ones who aren't." She trailed off, bent low over some knobs and buttons in her cruiser, then returned with a frown. "We always get bad reception out here. Ma'am, are you going to be all right to rest in the back seat of the cruiser while we look for your little girl?" My wife winced but nodded. The old-fashioned pack that the ranger extracted from her trunk looked bigger than she was, but she hitched it onto her back with ease. Her uniform, too, wasn't quite what I was used to, but the Forest Service brown color was familiar enough. Well, she asked, "you coming or not?" In between shouts of Kylie's name, the ranger introduced herself as Maddie Corvin. "We'll do a quick search of the area, but after that I'm going in for backup," Ranger Corvin said. "Keep the cruiser in sight at all times. You might think you know where the road is, but trust me, it's easy to get turned around out here." I could see what she meant. No matter which way I was facing, the carpet of ferns and dead leaves looked the same. Enormous tree trunks rose up from it like columns in some ancient temple. Then I glimpsed something that made my breath catch in my throat. A hot pink jacket. Ranger Corvin was yelling after me, but I only had thoughts for that sad little jacket lying in the mud. I ran to it, flipped it over. A pale, lifeless face stared up at me. Its eyes were hollow pits. Its mouth a crimson smile, sliced from ear to ear. A strangled cry escaped my lips. It took me a long moment to realize I was looking at some sort of doll. Its head was made of an empty hornet's nest. Its grin was painted on with what looked like berry juice. Who would make something like this? A bony hand squeezed my shoulder and I jumped. Maddie Corvin glared down at me. "I warned you not to run off on your own." She spat. I didn't understand why she was so angry until I looked around. I could no longer see the parking lot or the trail. I had no clue how to get back. And from the expression on Ranger Corvin's face, neither did she. She took out a compass and we both waited while its needle spun, and spun, and spun. Ranger Corvin took a deep breath, the kind you take when you're trying to get your fear under control. She replaced the compass on the side of her pack, extracted some reflective tape from a side pocket, then wrapped a strip of it around a nearby tree. "Looks like old Higgs wasn't completely full of crap after all," she muttered. "Huh?" I asked. "Bird Higgs, my predecessor. He used to say all sorts of strange stuff happened on this side of the park." "What did he say?" "Don't know. Never paid him much attention. I always figured he was just messing with me, you know? 'Cause he didn't like women in the service. I joined up in '73 and he retired 2 years later." My heart skipped a beat. There was no way that the 30-something woman in front of me had joined the Park Service in 1973. The unusual uniform, the old-fashioned cruiser, the bulky backpack, it was all starting to make sense. What? What year do you think it is? It's 1975. Maddie Corvin stared at me like I was crazy. Why? What year do you think it is? Before I could answer, a snapping twig made us both spin. The stag. I had always considered deer to be harmless, innocent animals. I cried when Bambi's mom died, and hunting had always made me queasy. But there was nothing harmless or innocent about the beast that was staring us down. Foam frothed on its black lips, and its eyes glowed with a hateful, alien light. It stomped at the ground, and that's when I realized it was getting ready to charge. "Look out!" Maddie started to yell, but I was already running. The primitive monkey part of my brain wanted to scramble up a tree, but the branches were too high. Meanwhile, the stag's hoofbeats were closing in. A brown blur passed beside me. Maddie Corvin. She was making for a narrow gap between two of the mossy boulders up ahead. She dove into the jagged space, and I threw myself in after her. Seconds later, antlers cracked against the rock behind me. Once, then again, and again. Ranger Corvin and I had backed as deep into the crevice as we could. The stag's antlers were too wide for it to pass, but it still gnashed at us with its square, herbivore teeth, like it was trying to eat us alive. Blood poured down its forehead, but it kept battering its body against the stone until it finally crumpled to the ground and lay still. Maddie and I looked at each other. She approached and opened one of its tightly closed eyelids with 2 fingers. The eerie light was gone from its eyes. The stag was dead. I asked Maddie if this was normal behavior for the deer around here. She looked at me like she wanted to skewer me on the stag's antlers herself. I could see why she was so frustrated. In our haste to flee the stag, we had completely lost sight of the tape-marked tree. Or so I thought. Even though Maddie had only marked 1 tree, behind us were 6 of them, each indicating that we had come from a different direction. "What the hell is going on here?" "Okay," Maddie said numbly. "So the tape isn't going to work. What about the rocks? These boulders had to roll down from someplace. We can follow them uphill until we're high enough to see the road." I squeezed the pink jacket in my hand. Kylie loved exploring, loved looking over the edges of high places. Would she also think to follow the big stones uphill? It was slow going. There was no path through the sea of ferns and enormous trees, no indication of direction apart from the trail of boulders. No birds sang, no squirrels leapt from branch to branch. The quiet made me paranoid. I kept looking over my shoulder when I really should have been paying more attention to what was in front of me. I was about to take another step when I felt a weight on my shoe. Something cold and heavy slithered across my foot. I heard a rattle. No, a lot of rattles. The ferns around us were rustling, but not because of any breeze. Maddie Corvin froze. We made eye contact and she reached slowly for the nearest boulder. I copied her. The feel of the rough stone was reassuring, but would I be able to scramble up it in time? No quick movements, I warned myself. Do not panic. No matter what happens, do not panic. With a shout and a kick, Maddie Corvin sprung onto the rock. Something long and writhing snapped at her as it fell from her leg. She was clinging to the rock by her toes and fingernails, but she had made it. Meanwhile, the rattling around me intensified. My blood turned to ice as the thing on my foot began to coil its way up my bare leg. Its scales were cold against my skin. The tongue of a second snake flickered against my ankle. "Maddie," I whispered. "Get going. Find Kylie." The look in Ranger Corvin's eyes as she looked back at me told me I was a dead man. But she understood that Kylie was my priority. She scrambled up the boulder and out of sight. The serpent coiled around my thigh, squeezing tighter. I held my breath, waiting for its bite, but it never came. The snake wrapped around my ankle, hissed up at it, and with a hiss of its own, it slithered down my other pant leg and out the cuff of my jeans. It was now or never. I very slowly lifted my boot and planted it on the rock. I would only get 1 chance at this, and if I fell, I was a dead man. Fangs shot out of the ferns and buried themselves in the sole of my shoe. It was all the motivation I needed. I threw myself against the rock face and clawed my way to the top of the boulder. The ground below looked deceptively peaceful from up here, and Ranger Corvin was nowhere to be found. I climbed from stone to stone until the slope of the land grew steeper. Up ahead, a jagged black cave opened in the cliff face like a hungry, toothless mouth. Several objects hung from the branches around it, more of those creepy dolls. The gruesome style was the same as before, but the clothes they were wearing were different. "Where I'm going, there are lots of kids like me," Kylie had said. Did each of those figurines represent a kidnapped child? I shivered. The breeze from the cave was musty and cold. Whatever was causing the strangeness in this part of the park clearly emanated from here. The dolls were proof enough of that. Did I really think I stood a chance against something that could vanish at will, control the minds of animals, and send a horde of snakes slithering down the side of a mountain? It didn't matter. My daughter's life was at stake. So many things had changed after Kylie was born, and one of the things I left behind was my cigarette habit. I used to smoke about a pack a day, but during my wife's pregnancy, I cut it back to 0. Even so, I never stopped carrying my lighter in my pocket. I couldn't have said why. Maybe I imagined having my last smoke in my final moments, like some 80s movie action hero. Instead, that frail piece of plastic was about to be my only source of light. As I entered the cave, the sloping stone ceiling grew lower and lower as I walked. I've always been claustrophobic, and soon I was afraid I would have to crawl in the dirt alongside the hand-sized cave spiders. But the path never grew so narrow. In fact, I couldn't shake the feeling that something just a little bit taller than me had been moving through here for so long that the tunnels had accommodated to its shape. Before long, the daylight and fluttering insects of the surface world were gone. There was nothing but me and my lighter, and I had no idea how much juice it had left. At any moment, it might burn out, leaving me in total darkness. The flame reflected off something up ahead. Dark and rainbow patterns shifted on its surface, reminding me of oily water. But the stuff was too thick for that. Glistening strands of it hung, mucus-like, from the ceiling. A tiny figure stood at the edge of the weird pool, looking doubtfully into it. Careless of whatever dangers might have been lurking in the shadows, I threw up my arms and ran to her. "Kylie!" "Hi, Daddy!" My daughter smiled. She didn't seem hurt. Not physically, at least. I asked her what she was doing here. "The man in the woods says I should go for a swim. He says if I do, I'll be able to fly and talk to animals. Just like him." "What?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "How? Who?" "I don't know. Why don't you ask him yourself? He's standing right behind you." At that moment, the flame of my lighter went out. I hugged Kylie to my chest and fled back the way I'd come. I hoped my foot slipped on a loose rock and I crashed headfirst into something that was cold, slimy, and taller than me. There was an awful, inhuman chittering noise. 6 long fingers grazed my hair as they grabbed for my head. Kylie screamed. I dragged us forward along the cave floor, ignoring the spider skittering through my hair and down the back of my shirt. The man in the woods, whatever it was, strode slowly behind us, taking its time, enjoying this. There was a light up ahead, but that didn't make sense. Even if we had made it farther than I thought, we still shouldn't have been anywhere near the cave entrance. The light bobbed closer, shone on our faces. It was a flashlight. Its beam flickered up at the thing hovering over us. "Stay down and keep moving," Maddie Corrin shouted. The boom of her gun echoed deafeningly from the cave walls. But in the glow of her flashlight, the path to the exit was clear. There was movement behind us, a lot of movement, as though dozens of child-sized things were scurrying across the cobwebbed ceiling. Maddie kept firing, and Kylie and I kept running. I set my daughter down as soon as we were free of the cavern. To my surprise, we could see the creek and even the cars from where we stood, less than half a mile away. It was as though whatever disorienting power permeated the place had faded, at least for now. Moments later, Ranger Corrin backed out of the cave, her pistol still aimed into the gloom. "Did you get it?" I whispered. "I don't know," Maddie answered truthfully. "But I'm not budging from this spot until I'm sure you folks are safe. Get back to your wife and get out of here." With Kylie on my shoulders, I staggered back through the ferns. My eyes swept the ground for snakes, but like the 6 tape-marked trees and creepy dolls, the rattlers were suddenly nowhere to be found. At the edge of the creek, I spotted something shiny lying in the mud. My keys. Heather sat up in the back of Ranger Corin's cruiser as we approached. "You're back so soon," she called out. "How on earth did you find Kylie so fast?" From Heather's perspective, I had only been gone for a few minutes. For me and Ranger Corin, however, it felt like half a day had passed. I wondered what Maddie would find, when and if she made it out of those woods. My wife's eyes grew wide as she heard 3 gunshots from the ridge above. There was something desperate about that sound that spurred me into action. Ranger Corin needed help, and we were the only ones who could get it for her. "I told you this was a bad place," Kylie sniffled, wiping at the cave dirt on her face. Heather clipped her into her car seat as I pulled out of the gravel turnoff and raced back down the 2-lane road to the small gas station that I'd spotted near the entrance of the park. Leaving the engine running, I dashed inside. A dusty bell jingled above the door. The place was a 4-pump store that sold overpriced drinks and firewood to tourists, while locals stopped in for bait and coffee. The woman behind the counter dropped a pot of it when she saw me running in. For Maddie Corin, almost 50 years had passed, but she recognized me right away. Her Forest Service uniform had been replaced with a yellow gas station polo shirt, and her hair had gone gray, but her bright green eyes had lost none of their sharpness. I had no doubt that the woman at the cash register was the same person who had saved my daughter and me from certain death only hours before. "You," she grunted in a voice roughened by years of booze and cigarettes. "I always wondered if you would ever come walking through that door after what happened. It's the only reason I stuck around here." When Maddie had emerged from the woods back in 1975, raving about missing children and missing time, there had been no proof to back up her claims. My family and I were nowhere to be found, and she wasn't able to locate the cave or the grotesque dolls again. The Park Service had let her go less than a month later, citing mental health concerns. She had worked here at the gas station ever since, listening to the tales the locals told about the odd animal behavior and unexplained sightings at the gravel turnoff by the creek. I warn the tourists about the place. I tell them there's a dangerous bear in the area. It's easier than the truth. And who knows, maybe some of them will listen. Out in the car, Kylie was getting antsy, squirming and kicking in her car seat. She'd been through so much. I made a point to grab a few of her favorite snacks from the gas station shelves, but when I went to pay, Maddie waved me away. "It's on the house," the ex-ranger smirked. "I don't know how to thank you." "Forget about it. It's ancient history. You really want to thank me? Spread the word. Let people know that if they notice kids or animals acting strange in the woods, it might be the only warning they get." I promised that I would. She waved as we pulled out of the parking lot, standing just as tall and strong as she had been in the moment we met. I hoped that whatever was lurking among the tall trees behind the gas station would allow her to live out the rest of her days in peace. I hoped, too, that I wasn't taking a part of it out of the park with me. Kylie was munching contentedly on a chocolate donut in the back seat. But when I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, her bright green eyes flashed up to meet my own. "Keep driving, Daddy," her voice said inside my head. "Keep driving and act like you don't know." A man once paid me to be hunted for sport. I had stumbled across his post when I was browsing the web for work. I was looking for some sort of side gig to pass the time. I was at a bit of a crossroads in my life. I had quit my previous job to break away from the redundancy it had sucked me into. It was a spontaneous decision with no real-life planning. Luckily, in this day and age, the internet caters to people like me, people who don't care about chasing money or don't want to be tied down. It wasn't the money I was after, but the change it would provide. I felt like I couldn't enjoy anything in life, like I was just going through the motions. That night, I had been scrolling for quite some time, skimming over job posts. Help wanted here, shorthanded there. I didn't think I would find anything that would suit me. It all seemed like the same thing disguised under a different title. That was until I found this particular ad. I thought it was a scam at first. Comical dollar signs on each side of the Craigslist title, like a trap set for the elderly in search of credit card numbers. I clicked on it anyway, curiosity getting the better of me. In all caps, the posting read, "Big money for manhunt volunteers." At least it was to the point. The details below gave a brief introduction as to what the job entailed. I skimmed them over with amusement, half of me doubting if it was true, the other half kind of hoping it was. As ridiculous as the prospect was, I had to admit it was exciting. There were some requirements for the job, however, and I was surprised to find that I fit the bill. Must be male. Must be young and fit if possible. Must not be afraid of the dark. Must come alone. No cell phones, no firearms, no police. Must meet the night before to discuss further. The list went on for a while, but ultimately ended with a phone number and a typed signature from someone simply named Bob. I found myself thinking it over. I didn't exactly have anything to lose, no family or friends. I always lived alone. The idea of wanting to pack up at a moment's notice never seemed to sit well with any of the significant others I had in the past. I don't know if it was stupidity or the need for adventure, but in the end, I found myself grabbing my phone. I mean, how often do people get to say they were hunted for sport? The money wouldn't hurt either. I gave him a ring. The man who answered the call was tipsy but eager, and when I mentioned my interest in his post, he seemed to be ecstatic, like I was calling to give him the lead role in a movie. The conversation was a little awkward considering the reasoning behind the call itself, but after a few minutes of cryptic back and forth, we agreed on a meeting place. I was a few towns away, but he insisted I meet him closer to his side of the woods. The hunt would be at his estate, and I should stay in town so I was well rested for the event. We would meet at a local bar called the Sixth Shot to discuss terms and conditions. He seemed determined, like he had been waiting for someone for a while. He said he would understand if I was in no hurry, but with my current status of unemployment and lack of overall plans, I found myself meeting his energy. I had to admit the concept was a little exciting, if it was real at all. We decided to meet the next day. The Sixth Shot was a bustling little place. A neon sign with a smoking gun made it easy to find. When I arrived, I found the guy immediately. He looked about how you'd expect a manhunter to look. He pulled it off well. A black polo and tan cargos, a shiny shaved head with a thick curled mustache, all worn on a very tan and muscular body. He was sitting at the bar alone, and he lit up like a Christmas tree when he saw me. Like he knew. He patted the stool next to him like he was welcoming a long-lost friend. When I crossed the bar, I was met with a firm handshake and a pat on the shoulder. He told me he was delighted to meet me, and drinks were on him. After a brief introduction, he got a glass of top-shelf bourbon for himself, while I sipped on an Irish red ale. I had acquired a taste for it recently. Considering he was trying to hire me with the intent to murder me, he sounded like a pretty cool guy. We got to know each other a little before getting to the serious stuff. The people around, enjoying their drinks, were none the wiser. The man known as Bob was actually Robert Callahan, a man born into a world of wealth and, as it seemed, perpetual boredom. His father ran a very successful chain of automotive stamping companies that he inherited from his grandfather. By the time his father passed, there were so many buildings and people assigned to making the gears turn efficiently across the globe without his input. He was able to live a life of leisure on a 7-figure income without as much as lifting a finger. The companies ran themselves as he got older, and he filled his adult years with seeking thrills across the globe. He tried anything that got his adrenaline pumping, from skydiving to whitewater rafting. He took a liking to hunting, which he said had started an escapade of finding the world's most dangerous predators and killing them, no matter the cost. He said he had seen it all, but in all his years, there was one thing he hadn't bagged. a human. I laughed at his extraordinary lifestyle, feeling a bit mundane when it was my turn to share stories. Mine was far from exciting. I left the more boring bits out, but I told him I spent most of my 20s as a park ranger. It kept me close to nature and the outdoors, but when it's all you look at, it tends to lose its luster. I left that to be a cab driver in a big city, something that kept me in transit and entertained for a while. Always moving, with so many people to observe in the busy city life. But in time, I found myself too contained to the city itself, which is why I recently quit. This brings me to about where I was right now, discussing being hunted by another man. He was fascinated, jotting down notes in a little pocketbook while he sipped his bourbon. We conversed for a time. I finished a couple of beers, and he ordered another pour of bourbon. The conversation was nice. It had been a while since the last time I went out with friends. Despite the fun I was having, we couldn't beat around the bush forever. When it came time to discuss the actual terms of our agreement, his face turned serious. I would be paid $5,000 tonight. Granted, I still wanted to go through with it. He said this would help me settle accounts before the event. He said he owned a mansion outside of town with over 30 acres of forest land. He was outside city limits. His nearest neighbor was 6 miles away. No one would hear screams or gunshots. We would start tomorrow night. I was supposed to get to his estate at 10 p.m. After my arrival, I would get 15 minutes to head into the forest as a head start. He explained when the 15 minutes were up, he would promptly signal with a flare. If I had any second thoughts, I needed to address them and withdraw from the woods before the signal. If I was still in the woods when the flare went off, I would be shot on sight. He said I would be paid $10,000 an hour if I survived. The hunt would go on until dawn, and if I was still alive come daybreak, I would be free. He would be armed with a hunting rifle and a combat knife. I would be armed with my wits. It was evident it wasn't in his plans for me to survive. But that was something I had already come to terms with. He studied my face when he said these things, perhaps trying to gauge my reaction. I tried my best to play it cool, despite being a little nervous. "Does any of this bother you?" he eventually asked, downing the last of his drink. "No, not really. I've always just tried to go with the flow. Doing that made me stumble upon your offer. Maybe if I get out and live a little, it'll encourage me to settle down for a bit more. That is, if I make it out alive." I winked, and we both had a laugh. "You're a riot. If I wasn't trying to kill you, I think we'd be pretty good friends." After all the details were ironed out, he paid the tab, and it was time for us to take our leave. We shook on it before going our separate ways. He was excited for the next day, a pep in his step carrying him to his obnoxiously lifted truck. He burned out as he left, almost rear-ending a Buick as he left the parking lot. I watched him go, feeling oddly serene in the cool night air. It was hard to describe. There was no one waiting for me to come back, no one to give me a courtesy call if I didn't show up. I didn't know if it was the thrill of the challenge or the drastic break in monotony. I spent my life trying not to be a creature of habit. Maybe this would be the last shift off course, or maybe tomorrow I would die and not have to worry about it anymore. With the moon shining bright and the cool breeze on my neck, I decided I would take a walk before sleeping in my car for the night. It might be my last time to enjoy a night like this. The next day, I woke in the backseat of my car, feeling oddly rejuvenated despite my choice of bed for the night. Through the blinding afternoon rays, I found my phone and checked my bank account. He was a man of his word. The $5,000 had been wired as promised. I decided I would go into town, indulge in some of the local variety, and find a place to shower before meeting Robert at the estate. I climbed into the front seat and left the parking lot, on my way into town. I called my landlord and canceled my lease. I was already living in and out of boxes, and my lease was month to month, so I wouldn't exactly be missed. After getting something to eat, I called and canceled all my utility accounts, electricity, internet, stuff like that. I had already put in my resignation at the cab company. There wasn't really any ties to my life at my apartment. I would either survive till dawn and get the biggest payday of my life, or not have to worry about the next step if I failed. Either way, this was the end of the current chapter of my life. After spending the day driving around town, I found myself heading over to Robert's property. The sun was already making its way into the horizon. His driveway was long and winding, leading to a gigantic house that looked like the surrounding forest was trying to swallow it. When I pulled up, it was already almost dark. A butler greeted me at the mansion, an old man carrying a silver tray covered in a soft cloth. He opened the car door and let me out, introducing himself only as Charles. "I will be taking your belongings now," he said. "If you don't make it out, they'll be destroyed at sunrise." He held out the tray. "Of course," I said, handing over my phone, wallet, and keys. After placing them on the tray, he offered a smile. "Would you like a refreshment before heading in? Mr. Callahan's staff will accommodate you before heading into the forest. He truly appreciates you answering his ad." "I'm fine. Thank you. I guess I'd rather just get to it," I said, wiping my sweaty palms on my jeans. "Of course. If you'll just follow me, it's right this way." He gestured for me to follow him. Charles escorted me through the house. The inside was furnished top to bottom with luxurious wooden furniture, bearskin rugs, chandeliers made of gold, and paintings from the Renaissance era. The estate was definitely worth a fortune. We passed by a trophy room filled wall to wall with mounts of animals from across the globe. They seemed to stare with their glass eyes, following us as we made our way through. Charles made no effort to engage in conversation, and neither did I. The other end of the mansion consisted of a large patio waiting for us. There was Robert, who seemed to be preparing for a little hunt. He was running a large combat knife over a whetstone slowly and methodically as we approached. Propped up next to him was a rifle, the bolt pulled back, several cartridges laid out on the glass table next to it, and the flare gun. "The time is approaching," said Charles, and Robert nodded. He wiped the blade off and sheathed it on his belt. I looked at his loadout on the table, starting to feel sick to my stomach. This was seriously happening. Now that I was here and seeing him fully prepared, I couldn't help but feel like I was in over my head. Robert stood and grabbed his rifle. He picked up each .308 cartridge and loaded them slowly, one at a time, until it was full. He racked the bolt forward, slung the rifle on his shoulder, and grabbed the flare gun. 15 minutes. Then flare, he said. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, twirling the flare gun on his finger. "No, not really," I said, making my way off the patio. I wasn't exactly sure what to say in a situation like this, so I figured it was best just to get going. "Excellent. I'll see you on the other side," he saluted me, and Charles gave me a nod. I turned and left the patio, making my way into the woods. Each step got heavier as I approached the trees, the darkness behind them getting eerier the closer I got. When I reached the tree line, I looked back at the mansion. Robert and Charles just watched expectantly. I swallowed and ducked in, feeling the full weight of my decision, perhaps a little too late. Once the mansion was no longer visible, I started jogging. I was mindful of my footsteps. A stray log or vine could trip me up. During my time as a park ranger, I spent dozens of hours hiking trails. I would survey the land weekly, picking up discarded things like trash and lost clothing. This landscape was much different, however. The ground was uneven, years of collecting leaves buried and fallen limbs and jagged rocks. I was wearing decent boots, but the terrain was unforgiving. One misplaced step, and I could roll or break an ankle. I wouldn't be able to rush too much, so I maintained a steady pace, hoping to put enough distance between us and maybe find a decent place to hide. With the sunset and no light source, I couldn't see very far in front of me. I tried not to think about how much time had passed. I just focused on pushing forward. The trees started to crowd, giant maples with lush branches blocking the moonlight. I ducked under them quickly. A twisted branch snagged my shirt, and I shook it loose. Birds screeched and roused from their perch, flapping away in a panic at my presence, their cries echoing into the night, sending a chill down my spine. There's nothing to be afraid of, I thought to myself. Not yet, at least. I came to a small clearing and took a second to catch my breath. I leaned on a tree, shaking clumps of mud and pine needles from my boots. The ground was wetter than I had anticipated. Off in the distance behind me, there was an echoing pop, and I looked to see the flare reaching toward the sky, a little orange ball of fire. I pushed off the tree and continued. I had to keep moving. I ran across the clearing. Each step squished on the ground as I went on. My third stride. My boot stepped on something awkward and hard. By the time I heard the clicking sound, I knew it was already too late. The sudden force clamped down on both sides of my ankle. I could do nothing but cry in pain. I stumbled awkwardly to the ground, agony shooting through my leg as the wind was knocked out of me. I looked down at the bear trap, blood oozing from where the metal jaws were buried. I was frustrated at my foolishness. Of course, he had put traps in the woods. Why wouldn't he? I forced the jaws apart, the mechanism creaking, begging to bite down again. My hands shook, holding the slippery metal, and my leg was barely free. I let it snap shut. The sound of steel on steel clanked into the night, so loud it bounced off the trees. A second later, I heard an excited whooping noise. I'd heard him. He would be coming. I tried to see my ankle in the dark. There were nasty gashes on either side, but I didn't think it was broken. I got back up. It would hold weight. It was just hurting like hell. I didn't want to look back when I pushed forward, panic starting to set in, trying to regulate my breathing. I moved as quickly as I could, one strong step, one baby limp. I scanned the ground, looking for more traps. There had to be more, surely. Branches whipped my cheeks and pulled at my clothes. I tried to be more careful, but I just couldn't see them quick enough. My left foot squelched with every step, blood soaking through my sock into the laces. I pressed on, hurdling a large dead log. I had to find a spot to hide for a moment to catch my breath. My heart was racing. I was having trouble thinking rationally as I could with the situation. A wave of fear washed over me for the first time in a long time. I'd gotten what I wanted, a thrill to make me feel alive. But as I looked down at my mangled leg, I was starting to regret it. Gunfire cracked in the distance. Branches next to my ear exploded, specks of bark and dust hitting my face from the racing bullet. I threw myself to the ground and started crawling, dragging my injured ankle with me. I dragged myself to a large pine tree and sat behind it, trying to come up with a plan. The gun went off again, closer this time. The round punched into the tree, shaking loose needles that fell from above. I squinted in the dark, trying to see ahead. In front of me, the ground started to slope, and I could finally make out the sound of rushing water. It could be a creek or a small river. Keeping behind the large pine, I slowly stood, trying to stick to the shadows until I was ready. I pushed off and started to run for the slope, hearing the gunfire again. As soon as I was in view, a fierce pain ripped through my shoulder, and my arm went limp, but I wouldn't stop. I started down the hill. I could see the shimmering surface of the creek below, something bobbing in the water, rotted logs from the looks of it. I needed to get down there, get under the water, and use the logs as cover. I worked my way down the slope. The ground was wet, each step threatening to slide out from underneath me. I heard footsteps now, breaking sticks and brushing trees as they tried to catch up. Another gunshot. The bullet whizzed over my head and missed. I tried to go down further and crouched, but my feet were too unstable. I focused on the water, a little bit closer and closer, like it was my salvation. I was almost there. Behind me, I could hear the racking of the bolt-action rifle. I shot a panicked look behind me. I could barely see him working through the trees, 20 yards away. As I turned back to the creek, my good foot got caught on something. I fell forward, hit the ground hard, and started to roll painfully and awkwardly in the dark. I watched my descent in a swirl of moonlight and darkness, my elbows and knees colliding with the earth as I went. I came to a stop at the edge of the water, lying on my back, gasping for air. I barely moved, my vision spinning as I looked up at the sky. I could hear him coming down the hill slowly and carefully. He knew he had won. He was taking his time now. Exhausted and defeated, I looked at the creek. It wasn't logs I had seen floating. Bodies. Several of them, bloating and rotting in the clear glow of the moon. I looked around. The more I saw, men, women, children. Robert was there now, boots squishing as he looked down at me. A pair of black goggles were over his eyes, a wicked grin on his face. He unslung his rifle and let it fall to the ground, then pulled the goggles off his face and cast them aside like toys. Disappointing. Very disappointing. I thought with you being a park ranger and all, you'd make it further. But here we are, at the creek. They never make it past the creek. Robert cracked his knuckles and pulled the knife from his belt. He held the knife in both hands and brought it down, aiming for my heart. I put up my hands to fight him, but it only delayed the inevitable. He worked free from my grasp and elbowed me in the head. My vision blurred once more. My arms went slack as he buried the knife in my chest. My lung collapsed as the blade went in, and with a grunt, he pulled the blade down, separating my torso down the middle in a nasty gushing mess. Satisfied, he got up and left me there to die. I tried to talk, but it all came out as gurgled whispers. What was that?" he mocked, and he knelt to hear me. With the last of my breath, I spoke my final 2 words, just loud enough for him to hear. Involuntary screams came next, loud and shrill, broken vocal cords shouting in a mixture of barking and screeching. With both hands, I pulled the large incision, yanking the flesh apart in a spray of blood and disintegrating organs. His reaction was the same as all others before him, a look of pure irrational fear. My thin, inky black limbs burst from the gaping wound in my torso. I was on him in an instant, slashing the knife away and digging my nails into his flesh. I ripped his shirt like paper and separated his chest just like he did to me, my piercing screeches ringing into the night until I burrowed so deep they could no longer be heard. He thrashed and oozed from every orifice as he made room for me, just as the cab driver did, and the park ranger before him. I ate and wriggled as he expired, worming and digging my tiny frame to each limb like a suit. When the fit was just right, I stood up and cracked my knuckles. I looked at my reflection in the water, running a hand over my new face to feel the fit. Better than the last one, for sure. I took my time going back to the estate, making sure my walk was just right and everything was in place. The hours passed as I settled in, feeling more and more at home as I worked the joints and muscles. At daybreak, I emerged from the tree line to find Charles on the patio waiting. He came to greet me immediately. "Sir, this one had you out all night. Was this one better than the others? Can I get you something to drink?" "Oh, much better than the last," I replied. "A bourbon, if you will." I've been a fire lookout for about a year now. I spend most of my life alone in a small, window-lined, one-room shack atop a steel and wood-frame tower in the middle of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. My only companions are my collection of cheap novels, a laptop computer with infrequent and unreliable internet service, and the two-way radio I use to communicate with the few nearby towers and ranger stations. Nearby is a bit of a misnomer, though. Using my high-powered binoculars, I can just barely make out Tower 12 on a clear day, situated several miles to my west. Tower 15, the next nearest to my location, only appears as a glint of sunlight to my east when the sun catches it just right. I've been told the Parks Department intends to put up some additional towers in this area as soon as it gets the necessary funding, which is probably no time soon. That's fine with me, though. I like the solitude. It helps quiet my mind, keeps the memories at bay. Mostly, I occupy my days either with simple maintenance in and around the tower or scanning the dense trees all around me for any signs of trouble. It's been a dry year, so the threat of fire is a constant one. This particular afternoon, I was clearing some brush from around the base of the tower that had begun to encroach on the fire road leading back to the nearby ranger station 20 miles away. Even with the heavy suspension of the government-issued Jeep, the road was a harsh ride at the best of times. I had just finished dragging some brush cuttings off into the tree line when the radio clipped to my belt squawked. "Tower 9. This is Tower 12. Do you copy?" It was Billy Johnson, my supervisor. Nice enough guy, I suppose. Tended to leave me alone most of the time. I straightened up and stretched my back, wiping the sweat from my eyes with my forearm and keyed the microphone attached to my shoulder. "Go for Tower 9, I replied as I replaced the shears and bow saw into the small storage shed near the base of the stairs. "John, do you have eyes on a bit of smoke north of your position?" "Stand by, Billy," I said, snatching up my water bottle and jogging to the metal staircase that wound its way around the tower. I didn't bother locking the 8-foot chain-link fence surrounding my little compound. Chances were I'd be back soon enough. Reaching the top, I stepped through the trapdoor and onto the walkway that circled the cabin, closing it behind me. It was habit at this point. The last thing I needed was to take an errant step and tumble down through the open hatch. I'd probably end up breaking my neck. As I passed by, I reached into the open door of the shack and grabbed the binoculars hanging on a nearby hook. Rounding the railed corner of the walkway and turning my attention to the dark green blanket of trees stretching out before me, I saw the smoke almost instantly. A thin trickle of wispy white haze rose lazily above the canopy some distance off. Probably just some campers, I figured, though there weren't any approved campsites in that area. We always had more than a few folks each season who decided that camping off-trail in the deep bush sounded like quite a hoot. Most of them come back just fine, oblivious to the danger that this wilderness presents to anyone not adequately prepared. Some of them have to be brought out by search and rescue. Some of them just don't come back. A ranger or a random hiker might occasionally come across the deserted remains of a campsite and report it in. Those are the spooky ones, the ones where people just vanished and left behind a perfectly set-up campsite. No explanation, no clues, just a deserted clearing, often with perfectly intact tents and personal effects. But there are bears and mountain lions, along with a handful of lesser predators that roam these forests, and sometimes they get hungry enough to stalk and even kill humans. And that doesn't even take into consideration the much more likely scenario, folks stepping out of their tents at night to take a piss and very quickly getting lost. Most humans aren't suited to survival in the wilderness, unfortunately. My radio squawked again. "Tower 9, what's the word?" "Yeah, I see it, Billy. Looks to be a couple of miles due north of my tower." "What's your plan?" he asked. I knew what he meant. Keep an eye on it and hope for the best, or take a trip over and investigate. After a brief pause, I sighed with resignation. It's probably just a campfire, but I guess I better head over and take a look to be sure. I didn't relish the thought of trekking to that area of wilderness, to be honest. It was the only area I hadn't explored during my time here. There weren't many trails heading in that direction, and the ones that did were badly overgrown and too narrow for the Jeep. A couple of miles hike might not seem like a lot, but when you're out here alone, the dense trees seem to stretch on forever. 2 miles can feel like 100. "Roger that, John," Billy replied. "Take your pack and your rifle. Check in periodically." "Will do. Tower 9 out," I said, replacing the binoculars on their hook and shouldering the red canvas backpack waiting dutifully in the corner chair. I grabbed the rifle from its rack over the doorframe, checked to make sure it was loaded, and headed out. As I locked the gate behind me, I threw my pack in the back of the Jeep and set the rifle beside it. The Jeep wouldn't get me too far before the brush made the trail impassable, but if it saved me even half a mile of hiking, it was well worth it. The sun was still high in the sky. I had plenty of time to get there and back before dusk, as long as I didn't dawdle. I started the engine and turned the wheels toward the unmaintained trail to my right. After only a few moments, the trees and canopy obscured any trace of the watchtower behind me. I was actually able to push the Jeep farther than expected. A pleasant surprise. I was probably a mile along the trail before it bent, and a massive pine lay across the path, much too large to go over. The dense underbrush around me ruled out the possibility of going around. I immediately lamented not bringing the chainsaw. Cutting it up and winching the pieces out of the way wouldn't have been too difficult and would have saved me a ton of trouble. With a quiet curse, I stepped out of the Jeep and grabbed my gear from the back seat. I smiled to myself as a quote from a certain fictional adventure-seeking archaeologist suddenly came to mind. "We walk from here." Making sure to mark the location of the Jeep on my handheld GPS, I stepped over the thigh-high tree trunk and continued along the path. According to my earlier estimate, the trail was heading in the direction of the smoke, which was a blessing in my book. The less time I had to spend bushwhacking, the better. The trail continued to narrow, as I expected, and before long, I was brushing branches and leaves with my shoulders as I walked. The trees, which had been alive with the cheering and chirping of animal life near the tower, now seemed muted. The forest around me was growing denser, feeling oddly claustrophobic at times. Billy checked in a few times, and I updated him on my progress, promising to maintain regular contact. He advised me that a weather relay from the ranger station had reported an approaching storm, likely to reach us before nightfall. A quick glance at my watch made me wince. I had already spent more time than I'd predicted. Maybe it was best to turn around and head back. The last thing I wanted was to get caught out here overnight with minimal supplies and a rainstorm. I wasn't worried, but it sure wouldn't be comfortable. If I'd been farther from my destination, I probably would have turned back right then. I wish I had. Within another 20 minutes, however, I smelled the faint scent of a wood fire. Not strong, but definitely there. I was even more certain of what I'd find when I reached them. When I stepped out of the now almost non-existent trail, I found myself in a sparsely treed area amidst a dozen or so wooden shacks, and I halted in surprise. I had reached the base of a hilly rise covered in heavy forest, and these old, forgotten cabins looked like they had belonged to some sort of small settlement. Perhaps an old logging camp, I thought. I didn't know this place even existed, and made a mental note to research it when I got back to my tower. I keyed the microphone. "Tower 12, this is John. Do you copy?" Billy replied, his voice staticky and distant. "Hey, John, Tower 12, what's your status?" I frowned and looked around at the towering trees all around me. I suppose I was asking more out of the portable radio than was reasonable. I was lucky I still had any signal at all. "I found what looks like an old logging or trapping camp," I said, meandering among the decaying and derelict cabins. Most had collapsed roofs and were barely standing. "The campfire has to be nearby. I'm going to take a look around a bit more." There was a pause before Billy spoke again. "What's your current location, John?" I glanced at my handheld GPS and relayed my position. Another pause. "John, I think you should probably just turn back. Come back, okay? You don't have many more hours of daylight left, and that storm looks like it's getting worse." Something in his voice sounded off, but I couldn't quite place it. Nervous, maybe? I couldn't blame him. My safety was his responsibility, and the idea of one of his lookouts being caught out in a storm overnight probably didn't sit well. Coincidentally, it didn't sit well with me either. "You may be right, Billy," I replied, turning around and casting my eyes over the area. "I'll just head." I stopped as my eyes caught sight of a bright yellow nylon tent just beyond the last of the structures. "Repeat your last, John." I didn't get that. "Stand by." "Tower 12, I said absently, making my way toward what I now realized was a small cluster of 3 modern tents situated around a central fire ring. The fire had been completely extinguished, but the embers still smoldered lowly, the source of the smoke. I looked around for the campers. Nothing. No one in sight or earshot. Sleeping bags and electric lanterns were still inside the tents, though I couldn't find any backpacks or supplies. "Hello?" I called out, turning in a circle. "I'm with the Forest Service. Is anyone here?" Nothing, just the muted echo of my own voice. I was about to dump some dirt on the remaining embers of the campfire and call it a day when I noticed the narrow footpath leading toward the slope. In the soft dirt were clearly recent footprints heading away from the camp. I keyed the mic again. "Tower 12, this is John. I found the source of the smoke. It's a campfire, all right?" "Nothing to be concerned about," Billy answered almost immediately. "Roger that, John. Head back home." I paused a moment, curiosity pulling me toward the footpath. "I'll be heading back shortly, Billy. Just want to check something out first." "I wouldn't screw around out there, John," Billy replied, an edge to his voice. "Better head back now so you can beat the storm." His last sentence didn't exactly sound like a suggestion. Something had him rattled. I hesitated before answering. "Acknowledged," I said, knowing full well I was going to check out the path before heading back. Still, I didn't feel like arguing with my supervisor over something so small. Just a quick walk up that path, then I'd be on my way. This path was even less established than the one I'd been on earlier, but I could clearly see the campers' imprints in the dirt as I went. Before long, I emerged into a small clearing, eyes widening with yet another unexpected discovery. The rough-hewn timber that framed the entryway was set into the near vertical slope of the hillside before me. It created a dark tunnel entrance that had clearly been sealed off with a heavy iron gate many years ago, likely by the Park Service to keep inquisitive hikers from falling to their deaths in an old, abandoned mine shaft. So it had been a mining camp, not a logging one. I didn't know there were any mines near here. Hell, I wasn't even sure what they could have been mining for. Coal? Maybe gold? Did they even have gold mines in Tennessee? Who knows? Certainly not me. Clearly, regardless, now that gate stood wide on its hinges, the remains of a rusted chain and antique padlock lying in the dirt nearby. Hell, I couldn't just turn around and leave. One of these dumbass campers had decided it'd be fun to explore a closed and restricted mine entrance. This is Tower 12. This is John D. Reed. Billy probably wouldn't be happy that I'd continued my exploration after he told me to head back, but there was nothing to do about it now. I wasn't equipped or trained for any sort of cave exploration or rescue. The Rangers had very specialized teams for that sort of thing. But I could at least poke my head inside and see if there were any campers, or hear them, confirm if they went inside. No answer from the radio. I tried again, with the same results. I tried a different approach. "Tower 15, this is John from Tower 12. Do you copy?" I said into the radio. I figured I might be able to at least get Nathan's attention if I was out of range of Billy. Tower 12. There was a burst of static that sounded like it might have contained the hint of a human voice, but it was too distorted and distant to make anything out. There was only a moment of indecision before I made up my mind. I knew it was reckless going into the mine, especially when my supervisor believed I was currently on my way back to the tower. But I had this nagging intuition that something might be wrong with the whole situation. Maybe someone was hurt and needed help. I couldn't just leave them there, knowing that I might be their only chance of rescue. In retrospect, I should have turned back and called it in to the ranger station. They could have mobilized the search and rescue teams that specialized in cave rescues. I should have. But I didn't. I pulled my powerful LED flashlight from my pack, turned it on, and headed into the pitch-black darkness of the mine entrance. The walls and floor had been smoothly carved many years ago, which made my footing uneventful, and the tunnel itself was mostly a straight shot. Several times during the first few minutes, I turned back to watch the bright square of daylight at the entrance gradually shrink to a pinpoint of light. By the time I'd taken the first dogleg turn of the tunnel, I was in complete darkness. It was a very strange feeling, oppressive almost. At one point, I turned off my flashlight experimentally, but after only a few seconds, I quickly flicked it back on. In that short time, my heart had been pounding in my chest, and some primal fear had begun growing inside me. It took a moment to calm myself. The darkness was absolute. It was almost as if you could feel it pressing in on you. My footsteps seemed much louder than they should have on the dirt floor, and the air was growing cold and damp the further I went. After another 100 feet or so, the smoothly carved tunnel ended abruptly in a wall of rubble. I couldn't tell if it was a cave-in at some point, or if this was simply where the miners stopped digging and hadn't bothered to remove the debris. But either way, it certainly appeared to be the end of the line. And then I saw it. I almost missed it because of the way the light and shadows played over the head-sized rocks strewn before me. But when I looked closer, I realized I was looking at a ragged hole in the wall. It was only 5 feet across or so, and definitely didn't look like the deliberate formation of the tunnel I was standing in now. It almost looked like the miners had broken into a natural void of some sort. Interesting. But there was no way in hell I was going in there. I was definitely not trained or outfitted for any sort of spelunking trip, and it didn't seem the sort of thing suited to the learn-as-you-go method. Just as I was turning back to make my way out of the mine, I heard the distant sound of voices echoing from the opening in the stone wall. The sound was faint, and may have just been my imagination, but I didn't think so. "Hello?" I called, pressing my face into the black abyss of the hole. "Can you hear me? I'm with the Park Service. I'm here to help you." Nothing. The air from beyond the breach was cold and smelled stale. Old. Wrong. It felt as if I didn't belong here. None of us did. There was a long moment of unbroken silence, and then I heard a voice again. Closer this time. "Did you hear that?" it said, presumably to a companion. It sounded like a young woman, nervous, uncertain. "Hello? Someone there?" That settled it for me. I carefully crawled through the opening into the space beyond. Shining my light around, I found myself in a small natural chamber, maybe 30 feet across, with an uneven ceiling of jagged rock that barely cleared my head. The first thing that caught my attention was the cracked lantern lying on the ground. It looked old. Very old. Maybe 100 years or more. A thick layer of grime and age covered its soot-blackened surface, and the glass was thick and uneven. Beside the askew lantern was a small leather-bound book, partially buried in the dirt and dust, with a moldering leather strap securing it closed. It looked like a journal. And without a thought, I tucked it into my backpack. Raising my light back up, scanning around the room. "Hello?" I called again. I didn't hear the voices anymore, but the narrow beam of my flashlight illuminated another tunnel in the far corner of this room, mired in darkness. "Can you hear me?" Once again, I got that feeling that something wasn't right. Then the voice came again. Closer this time. "Did you hear that? Hello? Is someone in here?" she asked, her voice trembling with apprehension. I hesitated, frowning. Something didn't seem right about the voice, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Before I could summon my words to respond, another voice called out. This time, it was clear. The voice of a young man. "We can hear you moving around in there. Please help us. We're lost, and our friend is hurt." Hear me moving around in there? I was shouting to them. I sure as hell wasn't trying to hide. Could they not hear me for some reason? I stepped forward to the secondary tunnel and raised my voice again. "I'm with the Forest Service." It was then, when I reached out to steady myself against the wall of the tunnel entrance, that my hand met something wet, and I recoiled in disgust, thinking I had just grabbed a handful of some subterranean slime. When I shone my light on it, however, it became very clear the reality was far worse. Blood. I stepped back, trying to keep the panic that was fighting to take control of my rationality at bay. I needed to keep a level head, for now. Panning my light around, I saw an astonishing amount of blood painting the wall and floor in front of me. Somebody had definitely been hurt, and badly. With blood loss like this, I wasn't sure I'd be able to stabilize them long enough to get rescue in here. What the hell happened here? And why did the hikers continue into the cave after one of them was injured this badly? Unless they lost their light and got turned around, there was no way for them to get lost. There hadn't been any branches to this tunnel since I first entered. All they had to do was turn around and walk until they saw daylight. The man's voice called again, colored with the unmistakable tinge of fear. "What the hell is that? Hurry up, Becky. Take my hand." He seemed to be getting closer. At least if I could guide them to my voice, maybe I could get them out of here. Get to higher ground. Radio for rescue evac. They had a helicopter permanently stationed at the main ranger station. It could be here in 20 minutes if I was able to reach them. The woman's voice came again, and this time I froze. "Did you hear that? Hello? Is someone in here?" All at once, it hit me. The indescribable unease I had been mostly successful in repressing now fought back with renewed vigor. I realized in that moment what I had missed previously. The woman had repeated herself, twice now. No change in her inflection, no variation in emotion or urgency. It was exactly the same, down to the syllable. It was like I was listening to a recording. "Did you hear that? Hello? Is someone in here?" repeated the male voice, now even closer. "Hurry up, Becky. Take my hand." Below the words, I could hear the stealthy sliding of something over rocks. It seemed like it wasn't too far beyond the tunnel entrance now, but I wasn't going to wait for it to emerge from the darkness. I didn't think that what I'd see emerge from the darkness would be a couple of college kids who'd had a rough time of it during a weekend camping trip. Allowing my panic to run free, I turned and threw myself through the cave breach and landed roughly on the flat stone floor of the mine shaft. Beyond skinning my hands to hell and banging my knee on a rock, scrambling my feet with a hiss of pain, I ran as fast as I could, not realizing until I finally burst into the waning light of the late afternoon that I had lost my rifle somewhere in that cave. It was darker than it was when I first entered the mine, and a quick glance to the sky showed the angry black thunderheads that had moved in, as promised, much faster than I had expected. I quickly swung the iron gate closed on screeching hinges and looped the chain between the bars as tightly as I could, securing it rather lamely with the hasp of a broken padlock. I stood there for a long moment, bent over with my hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath outside the mine entrance when I felt the first drops of the coming storm on the back of my neck. I straightened and looked through the bars of the gate into the ominous darkness beyond, realizing how ridiculous my barricade really was. It wouldn't do much good if something tried to get out, but at least it made me feel a little bit better. Until I heard the voice echoing from the mine shaft. Peh, getting closer. It was unmistakable. Uncanny. "Hello, can you hear me? I'm with the Park Service. I'm here to help you." By the time dawn arrived the next morning, I had climbed down from my temporary shelter in the low boughs of the red cedar and tried to work out all the painful kinks from my stiff shoulders and neck. The night had not been kind to me, but I was alive, which is more than my fiercest mind expected after yesterday. The night had been harrowing. There was no better word to describe it. The rain hissed among the trees and stung exposed skin angrily, driven by the banshee wail of the wind rushing through the forest, accentuated by the chaotic flashing of lightning and the heart-stopping crack of thunder. Because of this relentless chaos, it's difficult to say with any certainty. But throughout the night, I thought I heard something large trying to move stealthily in the forest near my shelter. I say, trying, because it felt like whatever stalked through the underbrush was more at home in the unnatural, Stygian gloom of a cave than under the watchful eyes of nature. Of course, it could just as easily have been my imagination. In the first dim light of dawn, as it started to illuminate the sodden and dripping forest, I spent the better part of 20 minutes straining my eyes with every ounce of concentration as I scanned the gray woodlands around me. I was only 10 feet or so above the ground, but there was no way I was going to step foot from my hide until I was absolutely certain that I was alone. Once I was satisfied, I was alone for the moment. I climbed down to the muddy ground. I tried the radio several times through the night and into the morning, but wasn't able to get even a burst of static that might indicate someone trying to respond. A combination of the storm and interference from the trees worked against me. My first thought was to get back to my Jeep as quickly as possible and run every drop of gas out of its tank, trying to get as far away from this place as I could. When I checked the GPS to see how close I was to its marked position, however, I found the unit unresponsive, with a disastrous crack across the screen that seemed to mock my dismay, probably caused by my less than graceful scramble from that damned cave. A rifle, no radio, no GPS. Perfect. I still had a compass and the rising sun to guide me, though, and that was something. I was only a couple miles from my tower, which should have been somewhere due south of where I stood. I knew that once I got close, I should be able to either find the service road or the tower itself, so there wasn't much danger of getting myself lost, at least. It was a small comfort, but one I gladly took. I moved through the trees and undergrowth with more speed and recklessness than I probably should have. An ankle broken by an errant misstep would have been bad news. Still, even though I hadn't heard or seen anything of my late-night visitor, I couldn't help but feel I was being watched. Do you know that creeping sense of dread you feel when you've just turned off the lights in the basement and now have to climb the stairs back to the light of the doorway? Or when you're making your way from your car in a dark and lonely parking lot? The feeling that something is there, something much more suited to the dark than you are? It's that same feeling that pushed my footsteps almost to a jog as I traversed the uneven ground and storm-felled trees that tried to hinder my passage. For the next hour, I moved at this pace, aware of every rasping lungful of breath, knowing that I should pause and rest for a few minutes, as pushing myself to fatigue would only increase my chances of falling or hurting myself. I imagined myself lying in blinding pain next to an unseen chuck hole, clutching at a broken leg and watching as the sunlight began to dim with the onset of dusk, waiting for whatever hunted my trail to find me. What would happen? Would I even have time to look on its visage before it struck? Did those campers in the cave? A misstep and a stumble that nearly made this nightmare a self-fulfilled prophecy jarred me back to the present. Against all instinct, I forced my pace to slow, first to a trot, then to a walk, and then reluctantly, I stopped completely, trying to catch my breath while I scanned the dense woodland around me. Nothing. No. Not nothing. As my heart began to slow and my breathing returned to a more manageable cadence, I turned my gaze back in the direction I had been headed, and an unconscious smile found its way to my lips. The sun had risen high in the morning sky during my flight, and now I caught a flash of its reflection on the windows of my tower, not 200 yards directly ahead of me. I laughed aloud with relief, fully aware that this fear-tinted eruption was closer to the manic cackle of lunacy than anything else. I didn't care, though. My feet started forward on their own, quickly reaching a brisk pace. A few minutes later, I burst out of the trees into the maintained clearing surrounding my tower, feeling the full sunlight on my face for the first time since yesterday. Had it only been a day? It seemed like longer. I was so filled with relief that I didn't even register the fact that the forestry department Jeep sat parked near my fenced-in tower until I started entering the combination into the gate lock. The faded white 12 emblazoned on the corner of the windshield told me that it was Billy's Jeep, which wasn't much of a surprise. I realized after a moment, after not hearing back from him, that I was more surprised I hadn't returned to find an entire search and rescue team making preparations to search for their lost puppy. I punched the 4-digit code into the mechanical combination lock on the gate and stepped through, making sure to close and lock it behind me. I stood there for a moment, staring through the tall chain-link fence at the dense tree line, wondering if something waited just out of sight in the shadows, staring back at me with hungry anticipation. I shook off the sudden chill as best as I could and made my way quickly to the staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. Billy was going to be pissed at me, I was sure, but that thought was a fleeting one that didn't take purchase. His displeasure was the least of my concerns right now. When I reached the top, I threw open the trapdoor and suddenly found myself looking down the muzzle of a very large rifle. Even in that brief moment of abrupt shock, I could register how the barrel trembled in the hands of its agitated master, and I wondered how close I came to having my life ended in a brief flash of light. The moment only lasted a second or two, and then Billy hastily swung the rifle away in a safe direction. "Damn it, John," he exclaimed, his tone an incongruous mixture of relief and fear. "I almost shot you." I stepped fully through the trap door and let it close behind me. "Jesus, Billy," I breathed, leaning back against the railing. I suddenly felt weary and realized it was likely the adrenaline now rushing through my system that had kept me moving at such a hurried pace throughout the morning. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded, stepping back inside my shack and taking a chair at the small table in the center of the room. I noted with mild interest that he kept the rifle leaning against the table beside him instead of stowing it in the rack over the door, but decided not to comment on it. Billy Johnson was in his middle years, maybe 45 or so, with a bit of a gut and grayish-brown hair, trimmed clothes. He wore an impressive mustache that reminded me of something an Old West gunslinger might sport. He was dressed in typical attire, khaki Forest Service shirt and brown cargo pants. In addition to the rifle, I had had the unfortunate opportunity to closely examine a moment earlier. I noticed that he wore his .500 Magnum in a holster at his side. That wasn't too unusual. When in the bush, bears and mountain lions can sneak up on you unawares. Having a hand cannon within easy reach goes a long way toward taking the fight out of them if necessary. It was a little unusual for a drive over to another tower, I suppose, but not exceptionally so, given the circumstances. I took the opposite chair, dropping my pack to the floor next to me. I realized my legs were still shaking anxiously and placed my hands on my knees to try to calm them. He was trying to deflect, but he was horrendously bad at it. He knew something. I was sure of it. "You know where I've been," I replied, gambling on instinct. I watched his face closely for a reaction and wasn't disappointed when he winced and turned his focus out the window and over the forest to the north. "I told you to abort and head back to your tower," he stated brusquely. "But you just had to feed that curiosity of yours, didn't you? You're damn lucky to be alive, you know that?" From my chair, I reached under the cupboard to my right and pulled a half-empty bottle of Jameson and a couple of mostly clean glasses. Billy turned his head and raised an inquisitive eyebrow. Alcohol was a no-no up here, but when I poured and handed him one of the glasses, he accepted it without a word. I took a pull from the other. "It's my own damn fault, I suppose," he continued, turning back fully to me. "It's been so long since anyone's even thought of Camp LeClaire that it didn't even click for me when you told me where you saw the campfire." I took another drink and then poured a bit more of the whiskey. "Camp LeClaire," I repeated. "That old mining camp?" "Logging camp, actually," he corrected me. "The mine was there long before the East Atlantic Logging Company set up out there. Nobody knows who dug it. Hell, nobody even knows when it was dug, a long time before the 19th century at least. Camp LeClaire was established in 1872, and the mine was old even before that." He looked at me in earnest for the first time since I'd returned and frowned. "You look like hell, John. Got caught in the storm, I'm guessing. Hell of a storm." I only raised my eyebrows as if to say, "What an understatement." Billy nodded knowingly and took another swallow. "Did you find the campers at least?" I shook my head and turned to look out the window to the north, where I could almost envision the black void of that mine entrance staring back at me. "No," I said softly. "I tracked them to the mine but lost them in the cave." I jumped when Billy's glass hit the floor and he was out of his chair before I even realized it. Billy hadn't moved from his seat, but now both hands were splayed on the table before him as if to steady himself. His pale blue eyes were wide and fixed on me. "You went into the cave?" he said, a sudden and horrifying realization dawning on him. It was then I realized my mistake. He hadn't known. He thought I had just discovered the camp and the mine, and then got caught in the storm overnight. A close call, but nothing that couldn't be undone. "Yeah," I replied, nodding slowly, deliberately. "Yeah, I went into that cave looking for the campers. The gate had been cracked open already. I'm not sure by whom or when." I leaned forward in my chair and stared hard at him. "Billy, there's something in there. I think it got those campers. I think it followed me out." Billy Johnson's face had gone white then, and I thought for a moment he might pass out. He scooped his glass up from the floor with numb fingers and poured himself another splash of whiskey, downing it in one gulp. When he spoke again, it sounded far away and distant. "Utami," he muttered. That's what the Chickasaw called it, and they were here long before we ever were. Blur is what the white man called it, among other names, Kuatami. He nodded. False brother, lying man, something like that. Hell, I don't know. What do I look like, a translator? It means bad, he continued. No matter what language you speak, it means something's out there that isn't supposed to be, something that was locked away a long time ago and forgotten. It was then that he stood and grabbed his rifle, as if suddenly remembering something. I need to get back to my tower and make a call now. I gestured to the radio base station sitting patiently on the table near the door. Why not use mine? Billy shook his head. Sorry, John. It doesn't work that way. Special phone, special number. I just hope I'm not too late. I started to stand. I'll go with you, I said. He pointed a stern finger at me and narrowed his eyes. No, you stay here, strap on your handgun, and make sure it's loaded. His voice was calm, almost cold, and didn't leave much room for debate. Still, I had no desire to stay alone with whatever this angler thing was roaming around out here. Billy, I can go with you. I can help. I started to argue, but it was quickly cut off when he took a menacing step toward me. And I realized quickly how much I'd underestimated him because of his normally easy manner. You will stay in your goddamn tower, and you will follow orders, he roared. I took an unconscious step back and reclaimed my seat, only managing a shaking nod in agreement. He took a trembling breath, pointed at the radio, and said in a slightly less terrifying tone, "And keep that thing on. As soon as I'm back at my tower, I'll radio you with updates." A moment later, he was gone, and the trapdoor slammed shut behind him. I stood and retrieved the Pelican case from under my cot. Inside was the same model of .500 Magnum revolver that Billy had been wearing, heavy and cold in my hands. I loaded it and belted it on the leather holster, feeling the reassuring weight tugging at my waist. "John?" I heard Billy call from below. I went outside to the walkway, leaning over the railing. He was standing beside his Jeep, 50 feet below, shielding his eyes from the bright sunlight as he looked up at me. "Make sure to keep everything locked. I'll come back for you," he shouted. I raised a hand to him and slid the latch shut on the trapdoor with my toe. I turned back into my shack as I heard Billy's Jeep fire up, and a moment later, it drove off down the rough service road toward his tower. I glanced back to the north, to the place where I had first seen the campfire smoke rising the day before, and suppressed a shudder. I was alone again, safe in my tower and armed, but alone. Abruptly, like an unexpected wave of nausea, the feeling that I was being watched washed over me with a chill, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I looked back over my shoulder to where Billy had been only a minute before, but saw only the rough service road and dense, impenetrable tree line beyond. That's probably just my imagination, but the feeling didn't diminish, and with every passing breath, I was more and more certain that there was something nearby, just out of sight, standing stone still in the gray-green foliage, waiting. I stood there a long moment, eyes straining for any hint of movement or alien shape among the shadows. But if there was, my human eyes weren't sharp enough to pick it out. I stepped back through the open doorway of my shack and dropped down into the chair again, my eyes catching the bottle of whiskey before me. I was tempted to pour another drink to help settle my nerves, but I could already feel the tickle of a buzz at the edges of my mind from what I'd already drunk, and quickly decided that was the last thing I needed for my reflexes and awareness to be dulled right now. I'd made more than one poor decision in the last 24 hours, and I didn't think adding another to the pile was such a great idea. Grabbing the bottle, I screwed the cap back on and reached to return it to the sparse cover to my right. As I did so, my boot caught my pack, knocking it over. Without a thought, I reached down to move it out of the way, and then remembered the old weather journal tucked inside the front pocket, the one I'd found in the cave. I reached into the unzipped front pocket. For a frustratingly alarming moment, my searching hand couldn't feel anything in the compartment, and I feared that I'd lost it in my chaotic escape. But then my fingers brushed the familiar shape, and I withdrew it, setting it in front of me on the table. I could see the book much more clearly now in the daylight. It wasn't overly large, a little larger than my hand, and maybe the thickness of my thumb. There were no markings on the front except for a simple, grimy brass loop that secured the leather strap holding it closed. I wasn't sure I wanted to see what was inside, but I needed some answers. Anything. A stray sound from the trees below rose to my ears, and I froze, listening intently for more, but none came. The forest around me was silent again, and I turned my attention back to the journal, pulling the strap free from the cover and turning to the front page. From the pocket of Andrew Robinson, it said. The writing was neat and compact and distinctly male. The ink was a rich black, scrawled upon brittle yellow pages, and though faded with the years, was still mostly legible. I turned to the next page, where the entries began. I felt as though I had dropped into his account midway, as though this was just the latest in a series of journals that Andrew Robinson had been keeping. 23rd July, 1891. After nearly a week of hard overland trekking, we reached the abandoned camp late this afternoon, exactly where the old trapper said we would. Sequoia Arpani, tracker, has once again astonished me with his overland navigation skills. I must admit I was skeptical at the yar in the old tavern, spun the crowded confines of the common house in Dun Creek, especially after I smelled the liquor on his breath. But the professor never gathered a moment. The man's instincts for reading human character are absolutely singular. The camp looks to have been abandoned, and I have to admit a certain unease as we inspected the rough cabins. There isn't a soul to be found, and it looks years abandoned, yet everything stands as if awaiting the loggers' return at any moment. Strange. 24th July, 1891. Our small troop, both intrepid adventurers, made camp in the center of LeClaire last night. Those cabins likely would have been more comfortable, but I doubt any of us would have felt at ease intruding upon them. Richards laughed it off when someone mentioned how peculiar it was that the loggers had departed in such a hurry that they abandoned their personal possessions. But I could see in his eyes that he felt it odd as well. Sequoia, our ever-courageous and solid guide, seemed ill at ease and unusually withdrawn, refusing all conversation and only responding in queries with quiet grunts. Something of concern hides behind his eyes, though, and I wonder what it is. Only the professor seems unmoved by the unusually still atmosphere of this place, and his typical infectious positivity keeps working at our unease, keeping it from expanding beyond its current state. Today, we spent much of the day exploring the area surrounding Camp LeClaire, and the sunlight was nearly spent when Dobson burst back into camp with news of his discovery. We all of us raced at a moment's notice behind him as he led us along an ill-used and nearly invisible footpath that led ever ascending upon the side of the northern rocky slope. When the path terminated, we were deposited before a truly curious sight. A barricaded tunnel entrance that had been bored into the rock face by some unknown hands. I suspect some sort of exploration tunnel or added dug-in search of precious ores, especially given the nation's more recent history with gold fever. The wooden barrier that had been roughly assembled from a hodgepodge of heavy timber beams was curious, and several of our group commented on it, but the professor dismissed the triviality, so the matter was dropped. It is far too late in the day to proceed any further, but we plan to penetrate the barricade and enter the tunnel in the morning. The excitement among the men is palpable. 25th July 1891. Sequoia is gone. He took his supplies and his prized Winchester rifle and fled sometime during the night like a phantom. This is a shocking blow to all of us, foreign to the professor, with whom the Pawnee tracker had partnered for a number of years across much of the eastern states. We have no explanation for his sudden desertion, and it sits unwell with the entirety of the group. The overall mood has darkened, I fear. Still, we must push onward. 25th July 1891 addendum. It took more than 2 hours of hard labor, but we were finally able to gain entrance to the mine shortly before noon today. Richards managed to get his boot caught between two heavy timbers as he stumbled forward, straining his ankle with a terrible cry. We feared it broken, but Dr. Franklin assured us that his bones seemed intact. Regardless, Richards was taken back to the camp, where he will convalesce while the rest of us make our entry. His part in our exploration has come to an end for now. We made our way in a single file through the added tunnel for some way before reaching its carved end. The light from our oil lanterns providing regrettably inadequate illumination over the rocky surroundings. When we reached the terminus of the mine tunnel, our hearts sank for a moment before the professor gave an exclamation of discovery and suddenly disappeared through a nearly hidden rift in the wall, surrounded by jagged rocks. We eagerly followed him through, careful of our footing as we went, and found ourselves in what I can only assume to be an accidental breach by the miners into a natural cave system. The air was chill and unmoving, but our excitement over this discovery laid any concerns or discomfort this may have caused. The professor directed us to set up a secondary camp in this new chamber, which we'll use as a staging point for further exploration. So, we spent the rest of the day bringing supplies for our main camp and constructing a smaller version in this moderately sized chamber. By the time we completed this endeavor, the efforts of the day precluded the start of the exploration until the group has had the opportunity to rest and replenish their energy. I feel I will sleep well tonight despite the anxious excitement buzzing around my mind. 26th July, 1891. Another shock. When we woke this morning, O'Connor is gone. The Irishman, who has ever been reliable and constant as the North Star, was assigned first watch last night. There is no trace of him, and no indication that he took any provisions or even his personal rucksack with him. I fear his natural inquisitiveness may have gotten the best of him and led him to explore the deeper caverns beyond our ad hoc base camp, for his lantern is the sole item that has gone missing with his person. The professor immediately rallied the rest of our small group, 7 in all now, and mounted a search for our lost companion. I tried to caution him against rushing into action, but he was not to be deterred. To my dismay, I was the sole man ordered to remain here at camp, whilst my companions took up their supplies and launched deeper into the cave system in the event young O'Connor returned in their absence. I was understandably disappointed, but grasped the logic of it well enough. I would loathe to think of O'Connor returning only to find us all gone, and then losing himself again, trying to find us. I shall endeavor to rest a bit. With luck, my companions will return before long with our lost compatriot. 27th July, 1891. I am at my wit's end, and I'm unsure how to proceed. It has been more than a day since the professor led the rest of the men in search of poor O'Connor, and I have felt their absence as keenly as I am aware of my own solitude in this cave. I've seen nothing of our missing companion or the party that delved deeper into the system yesterday morning, and I know their lanterns did not have sufficient fuel to carry them for this long without other means of illumination to guide their return. I fear they are hopelessly lost. I myself had to return to Leclerc for more lantern oil for my waning light. I must admit, with no little embarrassment and some reluctance, to my return to this dark place, which no longer carries any of its former adventurous excitement or fascination. It is now nothing more than a doorway into the deep places below the earth, where men were never intended to tread. But the growing apprehension is not the worst of it. The sounds, by heaven's grace, the sounds. I first became aware of them last night as I did my lantern and tried to set myself to sleep. At first, it was only an indistinct and muted echo, which may have been interpreted as nothing more than the distant whistle of wind or other natural sound distorted by the unique acoustics of this place. Then I heard the distinct tonal qualities that could only be a man's voice. I instantly rose and took my lantern, raising the flame and rushing to the entrance of the cave that swallowed my companions. There I stood, listening with such keen focus that I felt beads of sweat upon my brow. I would swear upon a holy book that it was the distant call of the professor himself, and I eagerly called back with as much fervor as I could summon, hoping desperately to guide them back to me. However, the instant I called out, the voices vanished, and I was met only with the suffocating silence of an open tomb. There I stood, straight as a sentinel, praying for a response from my friends. After several minutes of absolute silence, my thoughts began turning to dark things. I became painfully aware that anything beyond the weak cast of my lantern would be utterly invisible to me. But I, on the other hand, would be lighted as a beacon to it. I pushed these thoughts from my mind as forcefully as I could, inwardly chastising myself for seeing ghouls where none existed. I was about to call out again to my lost companions when I heard it. The voice came again, echoing from the claustrophobic abyss that lay before me, mired in the blackest darkness one could imagine. It was still some distance away, I estimated, but I was certain it seemed closer now. When the third time I heard it, I was just barely able to make out the words, but it was enough to be sure. My own words echoed back at me from the depths of that damned cave, and in my own voice, I staggered and nearly dropped the lantern. At that moment, could the legends be true? The professor always seemed to believe them, though I must admit I attributed his faith to the unwavering certainty he held in those things lost to antiquity. He'd always maintained that a legend, especially one whispered by so many indigenous people without mutual contact, must have some root in truth. But that line of reasoning is antithetical to modern civility, and I must reject it and focus on the more probable explanation that my already stressed nerves were turning my fears against me. The voices must be those of my companions, lost in the dark, but near enough to hear their calls. They must be. I'm not certain what lies next, but I know that I cannot abandon my companions, my friends, to wander the darkness until they fall from exhaustion or dehydration. Not while I might yet help them. I will leave this written account at the entrance to the cave. This lantern is nearly spent, but I have another with a full vessel that'll take its stead. If I do not return, at least someone may know of our passing here. May God be with us all. I closed the journal with a trembling hand, momentarily lost in what I just read. How is it possible? The journal was more than 130 years old. No animal alive then could be what pursued me now. What if it's not an animal? The sudden burst of static from Billy's call that simultaneously erupted from my radio base station and the portable handset clipped to my shoulder made me jump and drop the journal to the floor, heart pounding. I cursed under my breath and keyed the microphone. "Go for Tower 9, I answered, my voice tight as I spoke. My eyes drifted out across the sky to the east, where darkening thunderheads had been unknowingly gathering and marching slowly in my direction. I shook my head. Icing on the cake, I thought. "John, what's your position?" asked Billy, the self-assured authority that filled his tone now strangely absent, replaced with something else, fear. I frowned a moment at the question before answering. "What do you think, Billy? I'm in my tower, just like you told me." A strange pause before he spoke again. "John, this isn't some sort of joke, right? You're not outside my tower?" I was growing more agitated by the moment. What sort of question was that? I had no Jeep. There was no way I could have made it to his tower in such a short amount of time, even if I'd wanted to. "No, Billy," I answered with more force than I intended. "I'm not outside your tower." I stopped mid-sentence, a horrified realization sweeping over me. In that moment, I tried to speak, but my mouth had gone dry. "Billy," it was all I could muster. The radio was silent as my eyes slowly drifted to the west, where I could just make out the small, lonely shape of Tower 12. Barely visible over the darkening blanket of green, was that a gunshot? Another night, another goddamn night stuck in this window-lined prism. At least I have a good view, so I guess that's something. The storm raged all night again last night, and only let up just before dawn. At one point, the winds were gusting hard enough to rock the tower, which was a bit disconcerting, to say the least. As I stand out on the wet catwalk around my shack, I see that the clouds haven't let us go just yet, and look every bit as pissed off as they did yesterday afternoon. It seems like the last dry season has come to an end, which is good since I've been slacking a bit on my fire-watching duties over the last couple of days. Gallows humor, right? Due to that, or I'm sitting in the corner in a fetal position crying. I've been told by my ex-fiancée that I'm not an attractive crier. I haven't heard Pete from Billy since his last terrifying broadcast to me yesterday. I tried to reach him several times since then, but no dice. I've also tried reaching Nathan and the ranger station, but all I get is static, even from my base radio set. When I first started here, I remember Billy telling me during my brief orientation that the radio should be able to reach out 50 miles or more, so I'm not sure what's going on with them. Update. I just took a quick look at the base station and found that the cable leading up to the antenna on the roof of the shack is now just a dangly thing swaying in the breeze. The storm must have decided it needed the antenna more than I did because it's gone. I can see where the screws were torn out of the wooden mast, and before you say anything about whatever this thing is that's been stalking around and deciding to sabotage my radio, I should probably tell you that the wooden antenna mast looks like it's been around for a long time. The wood was probably dry rotted to begin with, and now that it's soaked, it's crumbled away into little wet brown bits as soon as I probed it with my fingers. Speaking of whatever this Kwatami or angler thing is, and I'm just going to call it a mimic, I think I haven't heard anything weird since yesterday. I'm assuming it's still over there somewhere, but I don't think it's nearby. If it's still anywhere around here, it's probably somewhere over near Tower 12, or at least that's what makes the most sense to me anyways. Which brings me to my shiny new lunatic idea. My Jeep. It can't be more than a mile down the northern track, still sitting there in front of that fallen pine. I could probably get to it in less than an hour, even with this wet and muddy ground. It had almost a full tank of gas, and I'm pretty sure I could outrun this mimic thing in it if I could get a straight shot down the service road. I definitely don't relish the idea, mind you. Every instinct is screaming at me to sit my butt right down where I am in this tower, and I know the ranger station will start getting a little antsy when Billy doesn't check in after a few days, but I'm also thinking they may extend it out a day or two in light of the foul weather. Maybe 5 days out in the wilderness, and then I'll have a ranger truck parked outside my tower. The question is, what they'll find when they get here. See, I've been thinking about it. Billy definitely knew more about this thing than I do. Certainly enough to not open the door when he heard it outside, pretending to be a Girl Scout selling cookies. That makes me think that maybe the fence and the trapdoor might not be enough to stop it if it really wants in. As pants shittingly terrified as the prospect of leaving the tower and making for the Jeep is, sitting here cornered in my window-lined shack, just waiting for it to show up in the middle of the night is worse. At least I have a chance out there. I still have the Magnum. It's been holstered to my belt since yesterday. They don't issue pea shooters for bear protection out here. This thing is the most powerful handgun in mass production. It'll put down anything in North America as long as you can hit it right. Any normal animal, anyways. Who knows what this thing is capable of? Still, it does provide a level of comfort and gives me some confidence that my plan may work. It's on my side for now. I'm going to try to eat a granola bar to put something in my churning stomach and try to build a little energy. I don't think I've eaten anything since yesterday. After that, I'm grabbing my pack and heading out. Wish me luck. I left my tower shortly after 10 a.m., and let me tell you, those were some of the most difficult first steps I've ever taken in my life. Stepping out through the chain link fence into that open space beyond my small compound felt like I was stepping off the roof of a skyscraper. When I closed the gate behind me, I stood there motionless. Must have been 5 minutes, frozen in place with my hand clenching the grip of my revolver that's holstered at my belt. Even with all the stress and anxiety swirling around in my head, I was amazed at how keen my senses seemed in that moment. I felt like I could hear every rustle of leaves and smell every damp patch of moss in the thousands of acres of wilderness surrounding me. In that moment, I felt very small, very insignificant, trivial. When my chest began to ache, I realized that I'd been holding my breath in subconsciously, afraid to make even the smallest sound. I let out a slow breath and forced myself to breathe normally again, scanning the trees. I turned slowly in a circle, eyes searching for anything that seemed out of place, like it didn't belong. But there was nothing there. Everything seemed normal, at least to me. Casting one last look over my shoulder at the refuge of my tower, I started off along the seldom-used service road to the north, careful of my footing on the muddy and uneven ground. I allowed myself to move at a slow jog, fast enough to make good progress, but not so fast that I was announcing my presence to the world. Not so fast that I couldn't hear the forest around me over my own breathing. I stopped a couple of times during my trek to catch my breath and take a drink of water, and thankfully still seemed alone and unpursued for now. I wondered if it was out there somewhere among the dense trees, hiding in the muted gray shadows of the forest. Or perhaps it had returned to my tower in my absence and found it empty, and was even now tracking my flight along this trail. If I paused long enough, would it suddenly appear, rounding the gentle curve behind me as it caught up to me, in order to prefer to move more stealthily among the trees and underbrush, laying in wait alongside the path ahead, ready for my approach? I had to forcibly shake myself of that line of thought. It wasn't doing me any good now. I was committed to my plan. The thought of retracing my steps and returning to my lonely watchtower held just as much terror, because now it's out there, unmanned, unwatched, and abandoned. For all I know, the mimic could be there at this very moment, ransacking my shack. I definitely didn't want to walk in on that little scene. I can promise you that much. I ended up making surprisingly good time on that northern path. It was only about 30 minutes before I saw the dim shape of my Jeep waiting dutifully in the middle of the path ahead. The matte tan paint job and black cloth roof stood out remarkably well against the muted greens and browns of the surrounding forest. Urging my pace to quicken, I covered the last 100 yards before I even realized it and found myself standing at the door, hand on the handle. I paused. A chill ran down my spine, inciting an unbidden shiver, and I realized then how quiet the forest around me was. I wasn't sure how long it had been this way. I felt that something was out of place, and so did the native fauna. On any given day, the trees were alive with the sounds of wildlife. Squirrels and chipmunks chittered, insects buzzed, and 1,000 varieties of birds called and sang from the treetops. Not now, though. Now it was as if they had all left. It felt very alone in that moment, only not quite alone. Somewhere out there, in that sea of trees, something stalked. Something that didn't belong in the light of day. Something that didn't belong under the watchful eyes of Mother Nature. I was pretty sure she wouldn't have let something like the mimic evolve had it not been hidden in its underground realm. The door of the Jeep was thankfully quiet as I depressed the latch and swung it open. If this had been a horror movie, I'm sure an ear-splitting screech would have erupted from its hinges. But in real life, we tend to take care of these vehicles pretty well. In the best of times, they are the only convenient transportation for 20 miles or more. In times like this, though, it was likely the only thing that would save my sorry ass. I jumped in and pulled the door shut behind me with a dull thunk, subconsciously locking it. I almost laughed when I did that. The entire top of the Jeep was nothing more than canvas and plastic windows. A feisty hamster could probably have penetrated my little haven, and I doubt the mimic would even think twice about it. The Jeep fired up immediately when I turned the key in the ignition, and I threw it in reverse for the most ungraceful 14-point turn you've ever seen on the narrow and muddy service road. Once I got it turned around, I didn't waste any time directing it the way I'd come. The service road was really little more than an uneven and ill-maintained dirt trail, and was only ever used infrequently by the rangers and lookouts. As I'd previously mentioned, it was a rough ride, even for the heavy suspension of my trusty steed, so I had to keep it at a reasonable speed. The very last thing I needed was to snap an axle or bounce myself right off the road and into the trees. Considering the condition of the trail, with the fact that it constantly wound and curved as it progressed. It meant that even my best speed wasn't much faster than I could run on foot. That's okay. Once I got past my tower, the service road was generally better maintained and followed a more or less straight path. I'd be able to build some decent speed there and be out of the wilderness and standing at the ranger station in an hour or so. The abrupt appearance of my tower caused me to feather off the gas as I rounded the last curve from the northern track. I slowed to a crawl and squinted through the now dirty windshield. From here, everything looked exactly like I had left it. The gate still stood closed, and looking up, I could see the trapdoor also appeared shut. Maybe this thing hadn't returned. Hell, maybe this thing wasn't ever going to return. For all I knew, I was headed in the opposite direction. It's not like looking at a GPS on it or anything. It was at that moment that I nearly pissed myself when the radio, still clipped to my belt, squawked, and I heard probably the last thing I had ever expected to hear. "John, are you there?" The signal was pretty clear, but his voice sounded weak, strained. I almost didn't respond. I was frozen in indecision, clouding my mind. I didn't know what I could trust to be true, but I doubted that this mimic had read the radio manual and learned how to operate the handset. I snatched the handset from my shoulder and keyed the mic. "Billy? Holy? Is that you?" He answered me right away, and I thought I could hear relief in his tone, buried under his pained words. "John? Thank God. I was afraid you were gone." My eyes drifted to the trail leading past my tower toward the ranger station, toward safety. Another 5 minutes, and I would have been there. I got to my Jeep, and I was just about to haul ass for the ranger station when I replied, "What's your status?" There was a moment of silence, and I wondered briefly if he hadn't even heard me. But then he answered, "I'm not doing too hot, John. I'm in my tower, but that thing hurt me. I've lost a lot of blood, and I've been drifting in and out. I've patched myself up as best as I could. I stopped the bleeding from my leg." He frowned and closed his eyes for a moment, asking a question I was pretty sure I knew the answer to. "Are you able to get back to your Jeep?" I thought I heard a coughing bark of laughter before he answered. "I don't think so. Pretty banged up, man. What happened?" "Billy, son of a... It got into my tower, managed to get a shot off, but not before it got a jump on me. I took off before it did me in, so I think I hit it. I don't know where it is now, though. My tower is wide open, and it hasn't come back, so maybe it's dead." I doubted that. Things never work out that simply. "Are you stable, Billy? Can you be moved?" Another silence, and then he said, "I know what you're thinking, John. Just turn your Jeep around and haul ass to the ranger station. That's an order." I dropped my forehead to the steering wheel, closing my eyes and cursing. It would have been easier if Billy hadn't radioed me. I know it's selfish. I know I'm an idiot for even thinking it, but I could have been blissfully out of range if he'd only waited for 10 more minutes. Still, I put the throttle down and got the hell out of there. I could still race for the ranger station, have them mobilize a chopper to come back for Billy. But they were at least an hour away. Factor in the spin-up time for the helicopter, and you're talking more like an hour and a half before anyone gets to him. It didn't sound good. Something told me it was unlikely he'd last that amount of time. I could still turn left. I'd likely live. But could I live with myself knowing that I left Billy to die alone in his tower? What if our situations had been reversed? Sure, I might be saying the same words he was saying now, but in my heart, I'd be pleading for that voice on the radio to help me. I couldn't imagine being in his position, lying there, hurt, bleeding out, knowing that his safe haven was wide open and that thing was out there somewhere. Look, I know what you're going to say. I know what you're probably saying already. Don't be a dumbass. This is exactly why everyone dies in a horror movie. I get it, believe me. I get it. But this wasn't a movie. My friend was lying there, dying in his shack. If I could get to him and get him into the Jeep, we could both get out of there, leaving this twisted nightmare behind us. Billy, I'm headed your way. Get ready, because we're going to wrestle you down the stairs and into my Jeep as quickly as we can. I said, cranking the wheel to the right and taking the western trail with more speed than I should have. John, I gave you an order. Get out of here now. Despite the situation, I managed to start a grin as my rig bucked and bounced over the uneven trail. Billy, I'd like to take this opportunity to officially tender my resignation from the fire watch. Now shut your mouth and conserve your strength. I'll be there in 15 minutes. 15 minutes. Trying to be a pretty good guess, and before long, I skidded to a halt outside Tower 12, next to Billy's ride. I opened the door and stepped out into the quiet air, my handgun coming from its holster and held before me like some sort of shield. I took a quick moment to let my eyes roam over the surrounding woodlands for any sign of movement, before quickly jogging around my Jeep and toward the compound's entrance. I passed through an open doorway, taking note of the heavy chain-link gate that was lying twisted 15 feet inside the fence. Another dozen paces, and I was at the base of the stairs, craning my neck to make sure nothing was awaiting me above. I kept the mic on my shoulder and said in a low voice, "Billy, I'm outside your tower right now, heading up. For Christ's sake, don't shoot me." I turned the volume on the speaker down just in time for his response. "Damn it, John. I told you to leave." Despite his words, the gratitude and relief were clear in his tone. I started up the stairs, revolver still held at the ready as my other hand ran lightly up the railing. My eyes were drawn to the red-black spots staining the gray paint of the steel steps. I found even more of the viscous liquid on the railing as I continued my ascent. Blood, but not Billy's. God, I hope that thing is lying in the woods, breathing its last breath. He definitely hit it, but I had no way of telling how seriously it was hurt. In a human, red blood indicated an arterial bleed, which was typically a fairly significant injury. With this thing, who knew what black-red meant? I climbed the rest of the stairs around the tower and stopped just below the open trapdoor. "Billy?" I called cautiously. A pause, then came his reply, shaky and with a wheezing sound I didn't like at all. "How do I know it's you? Say something I couldn't have heard you say before." "I have always admired and respected you," I answered without hesitation. He said under his breath, "Come on up." I took another couple of steps, cautiously poking my head through the trapdoor. Billy was sitting upright, more or less, resting his back against the doorframe of his shack and aiming his own handgun generally in my direction. As soon as he saw my face, he dropped his hand to the side, the stainless steel barrel clanging against the metal walkway. As I stepped fully through the trapdoor, I noticed two things immediately. Firstly, there was a significant amount of that black-red goo splattered around. Secondly, I realized how badly injured Billy was. His face had gone gray with a sickly paleness, and his breaths came in ragged hitches. Blood-soaked bandages wrapped both forearms, and his face was covered in a crimson rag taped haphazardly down. His entire khaki park shirt was painted in a hellish tie-dye of shades of red, but it was his leg that worried me the most. A tourniquet had been tied around his thigh, and he was groaning, but the pants leg was a cherry red below that, glistening in the late morning light. "Jesus, Billy," I exclaimed, holstering my gun and rushing to his side. He waved me off, saying, "All beside me. I know it looks bad. Save it for later. Let's get out of here before that thing decides to come back for another round." I nodded and stood again, taking a quick glance past him into his shack. A twin of my own tower, normally Billy's looked like a war zone now. His table and desk had both been overturned and smashed, along with his base-set radio on the floor. On the floor nearby was a satellite phone, its antenna and display obviously smashed during the attack. Lifting his arm over my head, I helped him to his feet. He grimaced in pain, but threw his remaining strength in with mine, and we began the precarious descent through the trapdoor. "Did you at least get to make your phone call?" I asked him as we took the steps carefully and agonizingly slow. He shook his head. "Got here just as I was getting ready to. Excusing your voice, telling me that you were from the Park Service and you were here to help." He looked at me with a shaking astonishment. "Sounded just like you, John." I looked over the catwalk, railing down at it. He winced again as we stumbled on a step. Almost there, John, he continued. Well, yeah, I've never seen anything like it. I shook my head as we reached the bottom step and moved onto the rain-soaked ground. I grunted with exertion. Save it, Billy. We've got a long ride ahead of us. Plenty of time for that later. He just nodded as I maneuvered him and ran to the passenger side of the Jeep and helped him climb in. Once he was in, I hurried back around to the driver's side door, got in, started the engine, and pulled the door closed behind me. Throwing it into reverse, I felt the wheels break loose as I stepped on the gas with a bit too much enthusiasm. I swung the 4x4 around and put it into drive, pointing it back toward my tower and beyond. Safety. I only had a heartbeat's warning from Billy before I saw it barreling from the underbrush at us. It threw itself, a great mass, crashing into the side of the Jeep, and Billy scrambled to get away from it, damn near climbing over the center console in the process and knocking my hands off the wheel. In a panic, the Jeep swung wildly left, and I stomped down on the brakes to avoid slamming into the trees. One of the front wheels dipped off the road, and the steel bumper crashed through a small cluster of oak saplings, halting us abruptly. The engine stalled, and everything went silent in that moment as we froze. My breath hitched in my lungs, and my eyes widened in shock as I laid eyes upon the abomination for the first time. My first impression was that it was much larger than I had thought, but the nightmare visage before me eclipsed such a pedestrian observation. The thing stood in the middle of the trail, still shaking its head as if trying to recover its senses after the collision with a 2-ton vehicle. It looked vaguely humanoid in a sense, but it walked on 4 limbs, clearly proportioned to such a task. It was hairless, and its mottled pink-gray skin stretched taut over muscles, bones, and odd unidentifiable bulges. The limbs seemed to have joints that bent in all the wrong directions and ended in what had been claws, but instead of the distinctive keratin-composed sharp nails that seemed so familiar in the natural world, these seemed to be extensions of the creature's skeletal structure, protruding painfully through its veiny, translucent hide. The worst of all was the bulbous and disproportionately large head, topped with an oddly gaunt-appearing neck. It was oblong and reminded me of the shape of a feline's skull. Its mouth seemed a jagged tear across its face, with ill-fitting and chaotically positioned teeth that didn't seem to allow the mouth to close properly. I couldn't see any eyes, but where they should have been, instead, there were 2 bulbous and cyst-like organs, seemingly bulging and flattening in a slow rhythm as if bladders were filling with air or liquid. I reeled back in revulsion as it turned its sightless head in our direction, searchingly. Flaps of skin on either side of its malformed snout opened slowly, like some obscene blossom composed of milky gray bat wings, and I had the sense that it was using them to try to somehow locate us. It was then I saw where Billy's shot had struck the creature in the face. One of the snout flaps was nearly completely severed, hanging limply in contrast to its sibling. A gouge furrowed by the bullet's travel creased along the right side of the thing's head, piercing and ravaging the bulbous organ on that side and leaving it a deflated sac. When it turned its head further in our direction, I could see clearly where it had bled significantly from the shot, but I was horrified to see that the wound had already sealed itself, leaving a shiny silver scar to mark the incident. "I knew I hit you, you bastard," Billy whispered, half to himself. The mimic stopped its motion, and we watched as the uninjured bladder on its head expanded like a half-filled party balloon. It dipped its head a bit, and we saw 2 membranous slits in the top of its skull dilate. A moment later, the twisted sound of a human voice assaulted our ears. "I know you're out there." The voice was unmistakably Billy's, but it was distorted and wrong. I thought that the wound from his gunshot probably had something to do with that. The thing raised its head again, turning a bit more in our direction. It took a few experimental steps forward, then paused and lowered its head. This time, we heard what sounded like the painful roar of a beast, almost perfectly replicated, except for that same distortion we had heard previously. "Killed a bear. I held my breath as we watched it again raise its head and take a few more contemplative steps in our direction, slowly swinging its grotesque snout back and forth. I could see how the flaps of skin that were flared open, where its nose should have been twitched minutely back and forth, and I felt like it was using them to listen for us. Knows we're here somewhere, but he can't see us, whispered Billy, leaning close. But if it gets close enough, I'm thinking we're done for. I looked over at Billy and realized that there was no way he'd be able to make a run for it in his condition. From the look of the thing growing ever closer to where we cowered in our Jeep, I thought it was likely we didn't have much time before it got close enough to hear our breathing, our heartbeats, or whatever, even inside the 4x4. And when that happened, I knew what would come next. Billy closed his eyes for a moment and turned to me. There was something in his eyes then, sort of acceptance. So he didn't like it one bit. "Get ready with the cannon," he whispered. "Only gonna get one chance at this." "What are you talking about?" I asked. A moment later, I had my answer. Billy took a deep breath and mustered every bit of strength to fling the door open and stagger out of the Jeep. "I'm right here," he shouted, limping weakly across the road from the Jeep. The mimic whipped its head in his direction instantly, but tilted its head to the side, seemingly momentarily puzzled at this unexpected turn of events. Billy held his own magnum in his hand, but it was too weak to raise it towards the beast. Still, he pulled the trigger, and a resounding boom seemed to shake the air. The mimic flinched at the defining sound of the gunshot, the flap of membrane at its snout snapping shut protectively. But its stunned hesitation didn't last very long. In an instant, faster than I would have thought possible, it launched itself on powerful limbs at Billy, knocking him to the ground and tearing at him with teeth and claws. I heard my friend screaming, then a horrible soul-rending sound that I'll never forget as long as I live. But now was my chance, and I took it. I swung the door open and stepped out of the Jeep, my gun coming free of its holster in the same moment. The creature was preoccupied with what was left of Billy, but as soon as I brought the gun up and thumbed back the hammer, its head swung around at me. It crouched like a compressed spring, preparing to launch, but I was quicker. The report of the gunshot was incredible, and the recoil from the powerful round rocked my wrist back painfully. The beast staggered, and I saw a burst of blood and tissue explode from a wound where its shoulder met its neck. It howled an otherworldly cry, sounding like a bedlam mixture of man and beast. But though the wound seemed terrible, it tried once again to throw itself at me. I was set on my course, though, and took step after step toward the creature, pulling the trigger again and again until the gun ran dry. All I was left with was the clicking of the hammer and a high-pitched ringing in my ears. The acrid smell of gunpowder stung my nose, and by the time I finally stopped, I found myself within only a few feet of the horrific thing. 6 blackened holes stippled the neck and torso of the creature where the bullets had entered, and I knew that the destruction of their exits on the opposite side would be far worse. The mimic lay sprawled across the ruined body of Billy Johnson, its weight crushing whatever had been left of my friend. Black-red blood spread out from beneath the thing's bulk like an oil spill across a smooth floor. I noted with some muted surprise that the creature still twitched and slowly flexed its powerful muscles, and a wheezing sound was quietly emanating from the slits on the top of its skull. I holstered my empty handgun and scanned around the ground for what I knew was there. A moment later, I spotted it. Billy's own magnum, lying half buried in the muck where it had been torn from its grip under the weight of the monster. I snatched it up and shook it clear of most of the mud and grass. Opening the cylinder, I saw that only one unfired round remained. That was enough, though. I approached the horror before me without apprehension or pause, my eyes focused on this thing that had caused so much pain and terror. I thumbed the hammer back and placed the muzzle against the mimic's head, which still convulsed with some small remaining life. I didn't know if it would be able to heal from the wounds I had already inflicted. Logic told me it was unlikely, but the silvery scar I'd seen from Billy's previous encounter caused me to question everything I thought was possible. I felt the tremors from the creature vibrate through the gun as the barrel rested against its skull, right between where its eyes should have been. I tensed my finger on the cold steel of the trigger, and the crack of the gunshot echoed throughout the forest. It was done. But even as I walked back numbly to the Jeep and restarted the engine, I wondered if that was true. I thought back to the journal I'd read, written more than 130 years before, and how it alluded to the tales of this creature going back long before then. As I drove the Jeep along the rough and winding service road, I wondered at the possibility that what we encountered was the only one of its kind. That the same beast had somehow terrorized cultures separated from each other by great time and distance, spawning the legends that the author of the journal and his companions pursued. It didn't seem likely. And now the door was open. The job of a Yosemite Park ranger isn't what most people imagine. A lot of people picture us as law enforcement types, handing out tickets and enforcing park rules, when really that's a very niche aspect of it. Mostly, we're just here to assist you, handing out maps, not speeding tickets, and giving people directions to the best views or ideal camping spots. We remind people about safety and weather conditions from day to day. But the main thing we do, and this is more vital than people realize, is that we're just here in case anyone gets lost or hurt. We deal with a lot of belligerent people who like to think the park is their personal playground, where they can do whatever they want. It's my job to remind them to follow the rules, to dispose of their trash properly, to pick up after their dog, and to clip its leash back on while walking the trails. Some people take this as a personal assault on their freedoms, when really, I'm just looking out for the safety of the other visitors, like cyclists and horseback riders who share the paths. Dogs can be unpredictable and can misbehave on trails, and we have to look out for everyone, not just them. Still, I don't get a lot of positive feedback for enforcing these rules. Nobody likes to be told what to do. Trust me, I get it. Every once in a while, though, something interesting happens to break up the boredom and monotony of the job. Last summer, I was walking around at night, doing a patrol of the campgrounds, when I saw something rustling around in the bushes. A guy came crawling out, dressed in a furry dog costume. I asked him if he was okay, and he just barked at me and crawled away in the opposite direction. A little while after that, I saw him chasing another person on all fours, someone dressed as a Catwoman, who went scampering away and hid in a camper van, laughing excitedly and making purring sounds. She licked the dirt from her fur pants with a long tongue. When she saw me watching, she clawed the air in front of her face, hissing territorially. It's not how I would choose to spend my Friday nights, but I'm not one to judge. By far the most interesting thing which has ever happened to me at Yosemite occurred last summer. It wasn't just interesting, it was utterly terrifying. Every night when I fall asleep, I have nightmares about that day. Every time I close my eyes, I picture those dark tunnels in the rock face. It all started when someone called in a report saying they were on Cathedral Lake Trail when their brother went missing. The pair had been out hiking and got separated somehow. At first, I thought it was just a routine mishap. People go missing in Yosemite all the time. It's no big deal in most cases, since usually the missing parties are found quickly enough. More than half the time, alcohol is involved, and I have to remind people to pace themselves if they want to indulge while camping or hiking. But every once in a while, those missing people don't turn up, and we have to dispatch much larger search parties. In this case, I went in on my own first, heading to where the man had called us from. I drove in on an ATV, since it was a 16-mile round trip. When I got there, the guy looked frantic. He ran over to me and started speaking way too fast to understand. I told him to slow down and just give me the facts. It's important to stay calm in these types of situations. Okay, I said, taking a deep breath and letting it out. He started talking again, a little bit slower this time. We were walking on the trail. He was right beside me. Then I turned to look at the lake, and when I looked back, He's just gone. Just gone. I tried to get a sense of whether the man had been drinking or doing drugs. It's not that I'm trying to assume the worst in people, but we have to think of these things. The simplest explanation is usually the right one, after all. It was much easier to imagine the two brothers taking sips of a Mickey and one of them getting separated and lost than to imagine one of them being abducted by aliens or taken in a very selective rapture. All right, slow down for a second. Take some deep breaths. What's your name? Let's start with that. Greg, he said, his face turning a shade less purple as he began to inhale air with trembling breaths. In and out. Okay, Greg. I took out my notepad, jotting this down along with his last name, which I'll leave out for the sake of privacy. And what's your brother's name? Dave, he said, sniffling as if he'd been crying recently. And where's the last place you saw your brother? Let's retrace your steps. He started protesting, saying that wasn't going to help, but I convinced him we had to at least try. Greg led me back a little way to where he'd seen his brother last. I walked back here already, and I looked around, all around here, before calling you guys. I thought maybe he went off the trail to take a leak and tripped, hit his head, something like that. I don't know. I was grasping at straws, but I think something... He hesitated. Something what? What do you think? Something took him, like those stories you hear about. He looked embarrassed, but I tried to get more out of him. Which stories? You know, you hear those stories about Yosemite and other national parks. I'm sure you've heard about them, even if you're not in on the conspiracy. Stories where people go missing like this, and it makes no sense. Someone turns their back for a second, and their son, or their sister, or whoever, is just gone, disappeared. Like Dave. I saw it on YouTube. Uh-huh, I replied, not sure what corner of the internet this guy had been visiting. Well, that doesn't happen around here, okay? I can assure you. Let's just keep looking. I'm sure he'll turn up. But the longer we looked, the less we found. It really did seem like the man's brother had just vanished. I was about to call in for more support, maybe even a canine unit, when the man yelled from a little ways off the trail, saying he found something. Following the sound of his voice, I eventually came to find him at the base of the mountain, face to face with the granite wall. At first, I didn't understand what he was doing there, so far in the forest. But as I got closer, I saw there was actually a cave, well hidden in the rock face. It blended in perfectly with the mountainside until you were almost nose to nose with the pale gray stone. Good job, I said, patting him on the shoulder. But then I looked around at our surroundings, getting nervous. We were far from the path, in the thick part of the forest, which was overgrown and tangled with vines and shrubbery. Do you think he would have gone into this cave on his own? I asked. Greg looked around, as if checking to see if his brother had left a message for him. There was nothing. It's not like him to just leave me on the trail alone, especially not for this long. If this was a prank or something, he'd have come back by now. I can just tell something's not right. Has your brother played pranks on you like this before? I asked. The man was in his 20s, and his brother was probably of a similar age. Young men occasionally get lost or injured trying to scare each other by pulling pranks or filming videos in the woods. It was rare, but it had happened before. Once or twice, he admitted. I didn't call you guys for a while because I thought he was messing with me. I wouldn't put it past him, but not for this long. I was getting annoyed. Mosquitoes were biting my neck, and I was sweating in the heat of the afternoon after marching through the foliage for hours. I imagined the guy hiding inside the cave, trying to scare his younger brother. Maybe he'd fallen asleep in his dark hiding place, or he was just pushing it too far. But either way, I was upset. If this was a prank, it had wasted most of my afternoon when I could have been doing better things. It probably annoyed me even more because I have my own older brother back home who played tricks on me in my younger days, and this was bringing back bad memories. All right, you can come out of there right now, I yelled, marching into the cave, thinking the young man would be hiding in a small alcove, and I'd give him a piece of my mind. I turned a corner and saw a dark tunnel leading deep into the darkest recesses of the granite. It seemed to go on forever. This made no sense. As far as I knew, there was no tunnel in this location. One this large would have been mapped and reported, but this had been well hidden, nearly invisible in the rock face. I wondered if anyone knew about it, and I wondered if it was safe. I didn't feel comfortable going in any further. The dark space seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance, and I was getting an eerie feeling standing there. It felt like I could almost hear voices whispering from all around me. The words were lost in the echoing cave, and I got a strong sensation that we weren't alone, like there were icy fingers walking their way slowly up my spine. The other man came in behind me, marveling at the cave for a second before continuing to press onward. "Come on," Greg said, forging ahead. "He might be in trouble." He was anxious to keep going. Not scared enough of this horrifying place with whispering voices coming from the shadows all around. His apparent lack of fear made me twice as scared. "I'm going back for help," I said, shuffling backward. "This isn't safe. Nobody knows we're here." My training and instincts were overwhelming my curiosity. But Greg didn't care. The man just continued going forward, disappearing into the darkness. A few seconds later, he was gone, and there was no indication that he had ever existed in the first place, except for my memory of him. "Greg!" I called out into the black abyss. There was no response. He might as well have been a ghost. An overwhelming urge to follow him rushed over me, and I took a few stumbling steps forward, feeling hypnotized by that black tunnel leading on forever ahead of me. But then I shook my head, slapping my face as I tried to wake myself up from whatever trance I was in that was overruling my common sense. I turned around and left the cave, my legs shaking and my hands unsteady as I called for assistance. After meeting the search party back at the trail, we went through the woods again to find the cave hiding within the 10,000-foot-tall rock face of Cathedral Peak. But it was gone. I remembered having trouble finding it the first time, thinking it was well hidden among the pale gray surface of the mountainside. You had to be nearly face to face with the wall to see it. It was so invisible among the crags and the boulders. I tried to tell my supervisor and the other members of the search party, but they didn't believe me. They said there was no tunnel there. They looked for hours and found nothing. Helicopters swept the area. More teams with more dogs, bloodhounds and German shepherds. But nothing was turned up. There was no trace of anyone having been out there. Except for me. Except for me, dumbfounded for the rest of the week, and for the rest of the summer, I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept going back to that conversation I'd had with the man on the trail named Greg. The man who lost his brother and then disappeared into a cave that didn't exist. More and more, I began to wonder what would have happened if I'd followed after him. It took a full year for me to build up the courage to go back out to that exact same spot again. It happened to be on the same date, around the same time of day. Only this time, I wasn't on duty. It was my weekend off, so I had plenty of time to comb the area for clues. My backpack was full of provisions, and I had enough to last for a night or two in the woods. Maybe longer, if necessary. Somehow, I knew. I just had a feeling. If I went back on that day and at that time, it would be there, the cave that didn't exist. Cathedral Peak loomed above me, getting larger as I made my way through the forest, moving toward it. The gray clouds above were shrouding the sun in darkness, while the thickening canopy blocked any remaining light from overhead. A chill ran through me, causing me to shiver involuntarily as I laid my eyes on the black hole in the rock face, so plain, clear to see now. Taking a step forward, I found myself standing right in front of it, and I reached out my hands to feel the outline of the entryway, as if to confirm it was real. I took a deep breath, like a diver about to submerge, and went inside. The air was cold and damp, with a strange coppery smell. My flashlight was on my belt, and I grabbed it, but decided not to turn it on. I was getting a strange feeling, like I was in an unsafe place and needed to stay silent, hidden. There was a sound coming from up ahead. I couldn't place it. It was like a slurping, chewing sound, like someone tearing meat from bones with their teeth. As I went deeper and deeper into the tunnel, the air became colder, so damp. I felt droplets of water running down my face, into my eyes. A trickle of light was filtering in from somewhere as well, causing the cavern to faintly glow in places. The air seemed to shimmer and dance in front of my eyes. As I went deeper and deeper, feeling entranced as I stumbled along in the shadows, I realized there was something wrong with me, as if I had been drugged. But strangely, I no longer cared. In fact, I found the sensation quite pleasant. But then I was abruptly awoken from my daydream as I came around a corner and saw the horror unfolding within the guts of Cathedral Peak. I can't possibly explain what I saw down there, and the shadows obscured most of it, drenching the monstrous creature in darkness. The impression I got was of something like an octopus or squid, crossbred with some oversized plant or dark fungus of some sort, sucking and slurping, chewing and crunching something between its teeth. After a few moments of inspection, I realized it was a person's face that was being eaten, as the details could just barely be seen in the dim light of the cave. Skin was being stripped from its cheeks, the eyelids ripped off, the lips peeled back and slurped up like noodles. Tentacles like tangled vines were slithering and sliding across the pale gray stone floor all around me. At first, I thought it was mud beneath my feet, but when I came fully to my senses, I realized it was blood mingling and mixing with the dust beneath my feet, creating a dark, toxic red slurry which sucked at my boot heels. There were tentacle vine things everywhere. I realized with numb shock my feet were actually stepping on some of them, and I was amazed the creature hadn't noticed me yet, if it was a part of them. But it was obviously caught up with whatever meal it was currently ingesting. Feeling very glad I hadn't turned on my flashlight, I began to back away very slowly, my boots crunching across the writhing tentacles. A sick knot in my stomach was rising up and threatening to make me puke, fear and revulsion twisting my gut. My mind was spinning, and my thoughts were racing. Understanding there was a very good chance I would never leave this place, I tried desperately not to step on any more of the squirming, writhing tentacles which moved and twisted on the floor of the cave, soaking and basking in the blood which had been spilled everywhere like pigs rolling happily in the mud. There's no possible way there could be so much of it, I thought. No one person has this much blood inside them. This is like a flowing river. And then I saw the others. They were hanging, suspended from the ceiling, from the walls, from everywhere, amidst the purple vine tentacles. They breathed in and out, still being kept alive, but just barely. Dozens of them were strung up and down the length of the cave, their chests rising and falling with weak breaths, but none of them opening their eyes or speaking. It was like they were sleeping. After a few long moments of searching, I found him, Greg, the hiker from the trail, who was looking for his brother. He was hanging upside down from the wall just beside me, his eyes closed. Parts of him were missing, a piece of his cheek, part of his hand. The wounds were slowly healing. The creature, whatever it was, kept its victims alive down there. I realized it was ingesting them slowly, perhaps even using other pieces of its victims as nutrients to feed the ones who were dying of starvation, like an otherworldly pyramid scheme built of blood and human remains. Tucking that mental image away, I grabbed Greg's shoulder, hoping to wake him up quietly. His eyes shot open a second after I touched him, revealing only the whites, and he began to screech. And I don't mean screeching like he was screaming out of fear or pain or anything like that. This was an inhuman alarm cry, which signified to me immediately that there was no shred of humanity left in him. He was now a part of the hive mind of this creature and its tentacle army. As his head turned on a swivel, I saw smaller tentacles were wrapped around him, going into his brain, into his neck, invading his ears and eyes, and drilled into his spinal column as well. I screamed involuntarily seeing these details and heard the creature in the tunnel as it recognized my presence. It wasn't fast, whatever it was, but it was huge, and I was in its home. The cave shook around me, dust and pebbles falling from the stone ceiling. As I backed away from the hiker and he continued to shriek, beneath my feet, the vines were suddenly moving quickly, sliding around so I couldn't find my balance, whipping back and forth. As soon as my shoes found purchase on the stone floor beneath me, I began to run. The tunnel was alive all around me now, the vines twisting and bending toward me, reaching out like greedy hands trying to grab me as I raced past. Looking over my shoulder, I saw the amorphous creature's central girth was finding its way through the cave and was moving my way, a lot faster now than I would have thought possible. But then again, I wouldn't have thought any of this was possible before living it. The light of the entryway was just up ahead, and I could smell the fresh air. I could see the sun. And then my feet suddenly slipped, as if someone had pulled a rug out from under me, and I went crashing to the ground, face first. My jaw closed hard, and I bit my tongue, causing it to bleed, the taste of copper filling my mouth. A second later, I tried to get to my feet. The mental image of those poor trapped people could be seen clearly in my mind's eye. Thinking back, I think the creature, whatever it was, needed us to be unsuspecting. If we were aware of what it was doing, its hypnosis wouldn't work. It was like a chemical it released to cause people to want to explore the cave, like a pheromone that insects use to communicate. Only it was geared toward people. But it didn't work well if you knew about it, and if you understood what the creature's purpose was. Still, it released more of that pheromone, or whatever chemical it was using to lure people in. And I actually felt my legs grow a little heavier. My eyelids, too. There was a powerful urge to rest now, and it felt like I had just worked 3 night shifts and really needed to sleep. But then the wave of hypnosis passed, and I felt the rumbling of the ground beneath me. That broke me from my trance again and caused me to scramble to my feet from the cave floor and run. As I neared the cave entrance and sprinted toward it, leaving my backpack far behind in an effort to lighten the load, I saw the rocks were actually closing in, narrowing the gap. The entryway was shrinking. Somehow, it was the vines. I realized they were what was camouflaging the entrance, their color changing to match the pale gray stone. I picked up my pace, the twisting forms beneath me making it even more difficult. I didn't dare risk a glance over my shoulder, feeling the rumbling of the floor and knowing the bulk of the creature was just behind me, closing in. The gap of the exit was narrowing even further, shrinking to the size of a dartboard. I dove headfirst into it, imagining my face slamming into a sheer rock wall as it suddenly turned to stone right in front of me, sealing me into this little dark labyrinth of suffering forever with the rest of those tortured souls. My eyes were squinted tightly shut as I felt the vines pulling and tearing at me as I went through the gap. For an instant, they squeezed in around my midsection, threatening to stop me like Winnie the Pooh after an unfortunate attempt at pilfering honey. But I popped out of the hole, and it sealed behind me in an instant. I heard a loud crash as the creature flew headlong into its own obstruction trap it had created for me, to keep me there. It hindered its own escape, preventing it from chasing after me. I could hear it thrashing and clawing at the vines, desperate for more flesh to sustain itself. Whatever it was growing too large even for its own control. Left alone to feed in the heart of the mountain, the creature would eventually destroy itself, would consume its own flesh to sate its monstrous hunger, like a snake eating its own tail. I had a very strong suspicion that was true. With that very specific idea in mind, I wandered back to my car. It was easier now, without the backpack and all the gear. But the walk back out to the cave would be harder. There would be lots to carry next time. After a trip to the hardware store, I went back out to the trail. It was nighttime now, and the place was abandoned. I borrowed one of the Ranger ATVs and took my supplies out to the spot where the cave had been. After bringing a few buckets of water from the lake, I began my work. Since I had marked the cave, it was easy to find again, and I began laying down the fast-drying cement on the mountain face. As park rangers, our job is actually to stop people from vandalizing mountains in this way. But I got the feeling Mother Nature would forgive me. It was my job to protect this place, after all, to protect the people who visited here. And nothing could protect people from this thing. It was best to seal it away forever, to let it slowly consume itself. Without a fresh supply of hikers, it would eventually run out of calories. It would eventually expire. It was only a matter of time. The vine tentacles squirmed beneath the layer of cement, groggily reaching out for me, trying to pull me in. I grabbed the trowel and slopped another thick coating of cement on top of them, and watched as it rapidly began to dry. The tentacles began to smooth out and settle back down again, falling asleep and looking very much like the rock face of the mountain again. That inhuman shriek could be heard from inside again, much louder this time, as if all the hikers the creature had abducted had woken up at the same instant, for just a second, and realized their predicament. "Sorry, Greg," I muttered to myself, alone in the dark forest. "I told you not to go in there."